What if everything you think you know about human history is missing 6 entire chapters? Not small chapters either, not footnotes, whole civilizations. Advanced, organized, sophisticated societies that rose, thrived, and then vanished so completely that almost nothing survived except whispers. Legends. Strange stones arranged in ways that shouldn't have been possible for the people who supposedly built them. Here's the question we're going to spend this entire video trying to answer. What if our civilization, the one building rockets and splitting atoms and mapping the human genome, isn't the first? What if we're not even the second or third? What if we're the 7th? I know how that sounds. Trust me, I know. The 7th civilization sounds like something ripped from a science fiction novel, not a serious historical investigation. But stick with me here, because the evidence we're about to walk through isn't coming from fringe theorists with agendas. It's coming from archaeological sites that mainstream scientists still can't fully explain, from geological records that show sudden and catastrophic changes, from flood myths that appear independently on nearly every continent on Earth, and from ancient texts that describe ages and cycles stretching back far longer than conventional history allows. Now let's be clear about something right from the start. The phrase 7th civilization isn't an established scientific fact. There's no consensus paper in a journal declaring humanity to be exactly the 7th advanced society to walk this planet. This is a hypothesis, a framework, a way of organizing genuinely strange evidence that doesn't always fit neatly into the textbook version of history we all learned in school. Some of what we cover will be solid archaeology, dated, peer-reviewed and verified. Some of it will be legend and myth that might encode real memory or might just be coincidence. Our job in this video is to walk through both, show you exactly where the line is, and let you decide for yourself where you land. Because here's the thing, something happened to human civilization thousands of years before the history books say organized society began. Submerged structures sit at the bottom of the sea in places that were dry land 10,000 years ago. Monuments across different continents show construction techniques we still struggle to replicate today. And practically every culture on Earth, separated by oceans and mountains and thousands of miles, somehow tells the same story about a great flood that nearly wiped everything out. Coincidence, maybe? Or maybe it's the echo of something real? If you're listening to this while drifting off to sleep, that's exactly why I make these. So go ahead, subscribe if you haven't, and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love seeing the comments roll in. Tokyo at sunrise, Chicago at midnight, London, somewhere in between. It's a strange kind of comfort, knowing people all over the world are falling asleep together to the same mystery. And if you're enjoying these deep dives, the best way to support what I do is to follow the show on Spotify and leave a 5-star review if you've got a spare minute. The link's right there in the description. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Now, let's start building the case, because before we can talk about civilization number 7, we need to figure out what would even count as civilization number 1. Before we go hunting for lost civilizations, we need to agree on what we're actually hunting for. Because if we don't define our terms carefully, this whole investigation falls apart before it even starts. So let's slow down for a second and ask the question nobody asks. What actually counts as a civilization? And more importantly, what would count as an advanced one, especially one that existed before the ones we already know about? Most people, when they picture an advanced civilization, picture something like ours. Skyscrapers, satellites, smartphones, factories churning out steel and silicon. That's industrial advancement. It's real, it's measurable, and it leaves behind mountains of physical evidence. Plastic doesn't just disappear. Concrete doesn't just disappear. Radioactive isotopes from nuclear tests don't just disappear. If a previous civilization had reached our level of industrial technology, we would almost certainly have found traces of it by now, buried in ice cores, sediment layers, or the geological record itself. So let's set that possibility aside early. We're probably not talking about a civilization with cell phones and combustion engines that vanished without a trace. But here's where it gets interesting. Industrial advancement is not the only kind of advancement. In fact, for most of human history, it wasn't even the most impressive kind. Consider urban sophistication, the ability to plan a city, engineer drainage systems, organize thousands of people into specialized roles, bakers, builders, priests, record keepers, all cooperating within a structured settlement. That's an advanced civilization even without a single piece of plastic or a single microchip. Consider agricultural sophistication, the ability to domesticate wild plants and animals, to understand soil, seasons and irrigation well enough to feed thousands of people from a fixed patch of land. That took genius. That took generations of careful observation and experimentation. That's an advanced civilization too. Consider maritime sophistication. The ability to build vessels capable of crossing open ocean, to navigate using stars, currents, and wind patterns, to reach islands separated from the mainland by hundreds of miles of featureless water. We already talked about the Denisovans possibly managing this hundreds of thousands of years ago. That's not primitive behavior, that's advanced problem solving under conditions that would terrify most modern sailors without GPS. And then consider astronomical sophistication. The ability to track the movement of stars and planets with enough precision to predict eclipses, mark solstices, and build monuments that align perfectly with celestial events centuries in advance. Stonehenge does this. The pyramids do this. Chichen Itza does this. This requires generations of careful record keeping, mathematical understanding, and long-term institutional memory. That's not something a wandering band of hunter-gatherers stumbles into by accident. So when we talk about an advanced civilization in this investigation, we're not necessarily talking about rockets and refrigerators. We're talking about organized, sophisticated societies capable of urban planning, agricultural innovation, maritime exploration, or astronomical precision, sometimes all four at once. A civilization doesn't need silicon chips to be worth calling advanced. It just needs to demonstrate a level of coordinated human achievement that goes beyond simple survival. Now here's the uncomfortable question. If a civilization like that existed thousands of years before the ones we officially recognize, why wouldn't we know about it? The answer is simpler than you might think, and honestly, kind of terrifying once you sit with it. Civilizations can disappear almost completely without leaving anything resembling a modern historical record. Wood rots, woven cloth disintegrates, mud brick dissolves back into the earth it came from. Even stone, given enough time, enough earthquakes, enough rising sea levels, enough centuries of scavenging by later cultures who reuse old blocks for new buildings, can vanish from the archaeological record almost entirely. Written language, if it existed at all, might have been recorded on materials that simply didn't survive. Papyrus burns, bark decomposes, clay tablets shatter. We only know about ancient Sumerian writing because a handful of tablets happened to be baked hard in a fire that destroyed a city. That's not preservation by design, that's preservation by accident. So the absence of evidence isn't automatically evidence of absence. It might just mean we haven't found the right accident yet, or that the evidence sank beneath rising post-Ice Age seas, along with roughly 10% of Earth's habitable land. We'll get to that later, but we also need to draw a careful line here, because this is where a lot of amateur theories go wrong. There's a big difference between a lost culture and a global predecessor civilization. Lost cultures we find all the time. Small regional societies that thrived, developed unique technologies, and then collapsed or were absorbed by neighbouring groups. That happens constantly throughout history and isn't controversial at all. A global predecessor civilization is something else entirely. It would mean a society advanced enough, organised enough, and widespread enough to have influenced multiple regions of the world, possibly explaining why flood myths, pyramid building and astronomical alignments show up on completely separate continents that supposedly had no contact with each other. That's a much bigger claim, and it demands much bigger evidence. So here are the standards we're going to hold ourselves to for the rest of this investigation. Verified dating from radiocarbon analysis and geological stratigraphy. Independent confirmation from multiple excavation sites, not just one dramatic discovery. Consistency between physical evidence and the mythological record, without forcing connections that aren't really there. And honesty, brutal honesty, about where solid archaeology ends and speculative interpretation begins. Because the moment we start with clear definitions and clear standards, something remarkable happens. Some of the strangest, most dismissed sites in archaeology suddenly deserve a second look. But before we look at those sites, we need to confront the biggest obstacle in this entire investigation. The problem that sits behind every claim of a lost civilization, every legend of a drowned city, every strange foundation buried beneath a later temple. Where is the record if human societies built cities, traded across oceans, tracked the stars, and passed knowledge from generation to generation long before the civilizations we know? Why don't we have their books, their maps, their monuments, their names carved into stone? It sounds like a devastating question, and sometimes it is. But archaeology has an uncomfortable answer. The past is not a library. It is a battlefield between human memory and everything nature does to erase it. Start with the simplest force of all, rain. Rain falls on a mud brick wall for a few centuries, and eventually that wall becomes a mound. Rain seeps into cracks in stone, freezes, expands, and splits monuments apart from the inside. Wind strips exposed soil away grain by grain. Rivers change course, cutting through ancient settlements or burying them beneath meters of silt. Roots force their way through floors, graves, and foundations. Insects eat wood. Fungi consume fibers. Bacteria break down bone. And time has a lot of help. Most ancient people did not live in stone cities. Even societies with impressive temples and palaces often built ordinary homes from wood, reeds, clay, animal skins, packed earth, and thatch. Materials that were practical, cheap, and nearly invisible to us after enough centuries. A thriving settlement can be full of workshops, markets, storage buildings, boats, fences, shrines, and family homes. But if those things were made from organic materials, the entire place may leave behind little more than dark stains in the soil, a few stone tools, scattered pottery fragments, and the outline of post holes where wooden structures once stood. Imagine trying to reconstruct New York City 10,000 years from now, if every building made of steel, concrete, glass, and plastic somehow vanished. What would remain? Maybe tunnels, maybe foundations, maybe a few objects trapped in unusual conditions. Now take away the roads, the bridges, the metal, the glass, and the plastic too. Replace them with wood, clay, woven fibre, leather, and plant resin. Then expose the city to floods, earthquakes, rising seas, scavengers, wars, and tens of thousands of years of erosion. That is what archaeologists are usually working with. And it gets worse, because the places people most wanted to live are often the places least likely to survive. Humans gather around water. Rivers provide drinking water, fish, fertile soil, transportation, and trade routes. Coastlines provide shellfish, ports, access to the sea, and some of the richest ecosystems on Earth. A settlement near a river mouth or protected bay could become a centre of exchange long before anyone built a formal city. Boats arrive, food is abundant, distant materials show up, ideas move with people, but coastlines are unstable. They shift. Storms tear them apart, waves grind away exposed land. Rivers deposit sediment in one place and carve it away in another. And after the last ice age, sea level rose by roughly 120 metres. Not all at once, not in a single biblical flood, but over thousands of years as ice sheets melted and enormous quantities of water returned to the oceans. That rise transformed the map of the human world. Land that had once been open plains became seabed. River valleys became bays. Islands were cut off from continents. Entire coastal landscapes, places where some of the earliest dense human populations may have lived, disappeared beneath the water. Think about what that means. During the last ice age, the Persian Gulf was largely a fertile basin crossed by rivers. The area now beneath the North Sea included a vast lowland known as Doggerland, connecting Britain to mainland Europe. Sunderland connected much of Southeast Asia in a single enormous landmass. The coastlines our ancestors knew were not our coastlines. Their best fishing grounds, campsites, harbours and villages may now lie far offshore. And underwater archaeology is difficult, extremely difficult. You cannot just walk across a submerged ice age plain with a shovel and start digging. The sites may be buried under mud, reshaped by currents, hidden beneath modern ports or sitting at depths where research requires expensive ships, sonar surveys, remotely operated vehicles and trained divers. Even when archaeologists identify something promising, excavating underwater is slow, fragile and costly. A single storm can shut down a project. Visibility can be almost zero. Every object has to be carefully stabilized the moment it reaches the surface. So when someone says, "We haven't found ancient cities beneath the sea," the honest response is, "We have barely looked." That does not mean there are lost supercities waiting on every submerged coastline. It means the sample is incomplete, dramatically incomplete. The same is true on land. Archaeologists have not excavated every inch of every ancient landscape. Not even close. Most of the world has never been systematically surveyed for prehistoric settlements. Dense forests cover possible sites, deserts bury them. Modern cities sit directly on top of older cities. Farms plough through shallow remains year after year. Roads, dams, mines and construction projects destroy sites before anyone knows they existed. And even where archaeology is active, excavation itself is selective. You cannot dig everything. Digging destroys the layers you are studying. Once a trench is excavated, the original context is gone forever. So archaeologists choose specific locations based on funding, access, politics, preservation, and educated guesses about where evidence might survive. That means our map of the ancient world is not a complete map. It is a map of discoveries, and discoveries are shaped by where people have looked, what they could afford to investigate, and what happened to survive. There is another bias built into the record, and it may be the most important one of all. We remember people who wrote things down. Writing changes everything. The moment a society puts names, taxes, laws, harvest records, myths, trade lists, and royal claims onto clay, stone, parchment, or metal, it becomes louder in history. Not necessarily more important, just louder. Sumer is loud because clay tablets survive. Egypt is loud because its dry climate preserved papyrus, tombs, and inscriptions. Rome is loud because it built in stone, stamped its names on coins, and left records across an enormous empire. Meanwhile, societies that used wood, woven cords, bark paper, oral traditions, or painted bodies may have been just as intelligent, just as organized, and just as deeply knowledgeable about their world. But if their information was passed from elder to child, singer to audience, navigator to apprentice, it may vanish the moment that chain of memory breaks. A culture can know the stars without leaving an observatory. It can navigate oceans without leaving maps. It can maintain laws, genealogies, ecological knowledge, and engineering traditions without writing a single alphabetic word. That is not speculation. We know oral traditions can preserve real information for astonishing lengths of time. Indigenous communities around the world have maintained detailed knowledge of landscapes, migrations, seasonal changes, and natural disasters across many generations. But oral knowledge is vulnerable. Conquest, disease, forced displacement, language loss, religious suppression, and simple demographic collapse can sever it in a few brutal decades. Then there is rebuilding. Ancient cities were rarely abandoned and left untouched. People returned. They reused the stone. They pulled old bricks from ruined walls. They built new temples over older shrines, new palaces over older palaces, and new streets over buried neighborhoods. In places like Mesopotamia, centuries of rebuilding created artificial hills called tells, layers upon layers of human occupation stacked on top of one another. Every new generation was both preserving and destroying the one beneath it. A king wants a new temple. The old temple becomes a quarry. A village needs a wall. Ancient dressed stone gets dragged away and built into it. A conquering army sacks a city. Metal is melted down. Statues are smashed. Archives are burned. And anything useful is carried away. Looters do the same thing on a smaller scale, ripping artifacts from their context and turning evidence into collectibles. The sad truth is that survival is not neutral. The archaeological record favours the wealthy, the powerful, the dry, the buried, and the lucky. A poor fishing village built from wood on a coastline flooded after the Ice Age has almost no chance of being remembered. A stone tomb in a desert has a much better chance. That can distort our entire idea of the past. We see kings because kings built monuments. We see elites because elites were buried with objects. We see literate states because states left records. And then we risk assuming everyone else was less complex simply because their lives left fewer durable traces. But now comes the line we have to hold. The line that keeps this investigation from drifting into fantasy. Missing evidence is not evidence for a forgotten high civilization. It is evidence of missing evidence. That sounds obvious, but it matters. A submerged coast could contain lost villages, trading communities, ritual sites, or early towns. It could even contain discoveries that force us to rewrite the timeline of agriculture, seafaring, or social organization. Archaeology has done that before. Göbekli Tepe forced scholars to reconsider what hunter-gatherers could organize. New discoveries in Southeast Asia and the Americas have repeatedly changed assumptions about ancient migration. But a gap in the record does not automatically prove pyramids beneath the waves, a worldwide empire, or a vanished civilization with secret technology. To make claims that large, we need positive evidence. Foundations, tools, dates, inscriptions, trade goods, human remains, environmental data, multiple sites that tell the same story. The missing record gives us a reason to stay curious. It does not give us permission to believe anything, and that is exactly why the next part of this story is so fascinating. Because scattered across ancient texts, temple archives, royal genealogies, and king lists, there are claims that seem to reach backward into a past far older than the official histories that preserve them. The question is whether those records are memories of real lost worlds, political myths designed to glorify rulers, or something stranger sitting in between. This is where the story takes a turn, because ancient people did keep records. They wrote on clay, they carved on stone, they painted walls, copied rituals, listed kings, tracked temple offerings, recorded eclipses, floods, harvests, and military campaigns. In some places they preserved documents for centuries, even millennia. But those records were not public libraries. They belonged to temples, palaces, priesthoods, and royal courts. Knowledge was power, and power was usually guarded. In the modern world, we imagine information as something meant to spread. You publish it, upload it, share it, but in the ancient world, a written text could be sacred property. A ritual formula might only be read by initiated priests. An astronomical table might belong to a temple school. A royal genealogy could be controlled because it decided who had the right to rule. And writing itself was rare. In early Mesopotamia, scribes spent years learning hundreds of signs. In Egypt, literacy was concentrated among a small administrative and religious class. If you could read the language of the gods, the taxes, the land boundaries, and the dead kings, you held a kind of power most people could never touch. So, when ancient traditions refer to hidden books, sacred writings, forbidden chambers, or knowledge reserved for priests, that does not automatically mean there was a secret underground archive containing the history of a lost global civilization. Sometimes it means exactly what it says. Important records were restricted because they were valuable, holy, politically dangerous, or simply impossible for ordinary people to read. But sometimes those records contain stories that seem to reach far beyond normal history. Take one of the strangest documents ever recovered from ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerian king list. At first glance it sounds simple. It is a list of rulers and cities, a record of who held kingship, where that kingship was located, and how long each ruler supposedly reigned. Versions of it were copied onto clay tablets by scribes thousands of years ago, and the surviving copies do not all agree perfectly. But they share the same basic structure. First, kingship descends from heaven. Then it exists in a series of cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. Cities that, in Sumerian memory, stood at the beginning of organized human life. And then comes the impossible part. Before a great flood swept across the land, the king list says 8 kings ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years. One king rules for 28,800 years, another for 36,000, another for 43,200. Numbers so enormous they make the reigns of later pharaohs and emperors look like weekend shifts. Then the text delivers one of the most famous lines in ancient literature: the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship returns to earth. It appears in the city of Kish, and from that point onward, the reigns gradually begin to look more human. Still exaggerated in the earliest periods, sometimes lasting hundreds of years, but eventually entering a range where some rulers may correspond to historical individuals known from inscriptions and archaeology. So, what are we looking at? Were the Sumerians preserving a literal memory of rulers who lived before a prehistoric catastrophe? Were the huge reign lengths based on a lost system of counting that we no longer understand? Were they symbolic numbers linked to sacred mathematics and astronomical cycles? Or was this political mythology designed to show that kingship had always been divinely ordained? The most responsible answer is probably that it contains more than one thing at once. The Sumerian king list is not a neutral historical document. It was compiled in a world of rival city-states where every king wanted legitimacy, by presenting kingship as a single sacred force passed from city to city. The list turned scattered local traditions into one grand story of Mesopotamian order. But calling it propaganda does not make it meaningless. Myths can preserve memories. They can carry fragments of real floods, abandoned cities, migrations and disasters, long after the details have been transformed into sacred narrative. Southern Mesopotamia was a land shaped by rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates could bring life, but they could also bring destruction. A devastating regional flood could easily become, in collective memory, the flood that ended an entire age. And the cities named before the flood were not random inventions. Several were real places, ancient even by Mesopotamian standards. Eridu, especially, was remembered as a city of beginnings, a place associated with the god Enki and the deep fresh water beneath the earth. That does not prove Eridu existed before some global deluge. It does tell us that the Sumerians themselves imagined their civilization as standing on the ruins of a world older than their own. Egypt preserved a different kind of deep time memory. Egyptian temples were not just places of worship. They were economic institutions, schools, archives, ritual centers, and storehouses of inherited knowledge. Priests maintained calendars, copied sacred texts, recorded donations, tracked land, and preserved long lists of kings. Some of these records survive. The Palermo stone preserves royal annals from Egypt's early dynasties. The Turin king list, written on papyrus, names rulers stretching back through dynastic history. Temple walls at places like Abydos preserve carefully selected royal genealogies, showing which kings later rulers wanted remembered. Notice that word, selected. A king list is never just a list. It is an argument. It tells you who belongs in the chain of legitimacy. It can erase unpopular rulers, foreign rulers, defeated rivals, women who ruled too successfully, or entire periods of chaos that later dynasties wanted to forget. Egyptian history was carefully curated because the continuity of kingship was tied to the stability of the universe itself. The pharaoh was not merely a political leader. He was the defender of Mat, the cosmic order that kept the sun rising, the Nile flooding, and society from collapsing into chaos. So when Egyptian priests spoke of a past extending beyond known dynasties, they were speaking from within a tradition where history, ritual, and cosmic order were woven tightly together. Later Greek writers were fascinated by this. The priest Manetho, writing in Egypt during the 3rd century BCE, organized Egyptian rulers into the dynasties historians still use today, but the original work survives only through later quotations and summaries, which makes parts of it difficult to evaluate. In those later accounts, Manetho's chronology appears to extend far back into semi-divine rulers, spirits, and heroic beings before the human dynasties. That sounds familiar. Gods, demigods, then kings. Mesopotamia had a similar pattern. So did many other ancient traditions. But that does not mean these cultures were independently documenting 6 technological civilizations before ours. It means ancient people often placed ordinary human history inside a much larger sacred timeline. Their past was not just a sequence of dates, it was an age of gods, catastrophes, founders, and repeated restorations of order. Then there is the most famous Egyptian claim of all. According to Plato, the Athenian lawgiver Solon travelled to Egypt and heard a story from priests at Sais. They told him that Greece was young, that civilizations had repeatedly been destroyed by floods and fire, and that Egypt remembered much older events because its land had been spared the worst of these catastrophes. Among those events, Plato places the story of Atlantis. But here we have to be precise. We do not possess an Egyptian temple inscription describing Atlantis. We have Plato's dialogues, written centuries after Solon supposedly heard the story. Whether Plato was reporting an authentic Egyptian tradition, reshaping fragments of one, or constructing a philosophical warning about pride and imperial power remains fiercely debated. The story is powerful, the evidence is not simple. And that distinction matters even more when we get to modern claims of secret archives. You may have heard of a hall of records beneath the Sphinx, a hidden chamber containing ancient books, maps, or the testimony of survivors from Atlantis. You may have heard that Egyptian priests concealed forbidden knowledge below pyramids, that the Vatican holds proof of lost civilizations, or that major religious centers hide documents too explosive for the public to see. These stories spread because they are irresistible. Of course there must be a locked room somewhere. Of course the truth must be buried under the most famous monument on earth. Of course powerful institutions must be hiding the final missing piece. But the evidence for these claims is usually much weaker than the stories. There are real chambers, tunnels, storage rooms, and unexplored spaces in ancient monuments. Archaeology continues to find new things. The Great Pyramid itself still contains mysteries, including voids detected through modern scanning. Temples were repeatedly rebuilt over older structures. Archives have been discovered in unexpected places, from palace rooms to buried jars to collapsed libraries. But a mysterious space is not automatically a secret archive, and a restricted archive is not automatically evidence of a lost advanced civilization. The real surviving texts are already astonishing enough. Clay tablets from Mesopotamia preserve myths and accounting records written more than 4,000 years ago. Egyptian papyri preserve medical recipes, legal disputes, letters, hymns, and lists of kings. Thousands of documents were lost forever, but thousands also survived against impossible odds. What they reveal is not a clean answer. It is something more unsettling. Ancient people remembered worlds before their own. They imagined floods that reset history. They preserved king lists that stretched into impossible time. They built temples over older temples, copied texts from damaged originals, and treated knowledge as something sacred enough to protect, dangerous enough to restrict, and valuable enough to pass across generations. The question is not whether every secret archive claim is true. Most cannot be demonstrated. The question is why so many civilizations believed the past was deeper than the visible ruins around them. And when we begin looking at the archaeological sites themselves, the first civilization on our list may show exactly why they felt that way. Because at Göbekli Tepe, in southeastern Turkey, people were organizing monumental construction on a scale nobody expected, thousands of years before farming was supposed to make civilization possible. Göbekli Tepe sits on a limestone ridge in southeastern Anatolia, in what is now Turkey. For thousands of years, it was just another hill in a landscape full of older hills, dry grass, scattered stone, and the ruins of things nobody remembered building. Then archaeologists began digging. What they found was not a village in the usual sense. Not a cluster of mud brick houses, not fields, irrigation ditches, grain stores, palace walls, or written records. They found circles of stone, massive limestone pillars, some more than 5 meters tall and weighing many tons, set into carefully built enclosures. Most are shaped like giant T's. 2 enormous pillars stand near the center of each enclosure, surrounded by smaller pillars embedded in stone walls. And carved into those pillars are images of foxes, boars, snakes, cranes, wild cattle, spiders, scorpions, vultures, and strange human-like figures with arms, hands, belts, and loincloths. These were not random rocks placed in the ground by people passing time between hunts. They were planned monuments. Quarrying the stone alone required knowledge, coordination, and labour. Moving it required groups working together. Setting pillars upright required engineering, ropes, leverage, timing, and people capable of following a shared plan. The carvings required skilled artisans, and all of it required a society able to feed, organise and motivate workers long enough to create something that did not put food directly into anyone's stomach. The oldest levels of Göbekli Tepe date to around 9,600 BCE. That is the part that makes your brain stop for a second. This was before pottery, before metal tools, before writing, before the pyramids by more than 7,000 years, before Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years, and, according to the old textbook version of history, before agriculture had fully transformed human life. For generations the story seemed straightforward. First, humans lived as mobile hunter-gatherers. Then they began farming. Farming created food surpluses. Surpluses allowed permanent villages. Villages grew into towns. Towns created priests, rulers, labor specialization, temples, and eventually civilization. Food first, monuments later. Göbekli Tepe appeared to reverse the order. Here were monumental ritual structures built by communities still heavily dependent on hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants. The bones found at the site include wild gazelle, wild boar, red deer and aurochs, the powerful wild ancestors of modern cattle. There is evidence of feasting on a large scale. People were gathering, slaughtering animals, preparing food, and participating in something bigger than the needs of a single household. So maybe it was not farming that created the first great communal projects. Maybe communal projects helped create farming. Think about what happens when groups gather regularly at one sacred location. A few families become dozens. Dozens become hundreds. People need food, water, shelter, tools, firewood, and ways to coordinate. They need reliable supplies. They begin returning to the same places at the same times of year. They learn which wild grains grow nearby, how to harvest them efficiently, how to store them perhaps, how to encourage them to grow in useful places. Ritual might not have been the result of settled life. Ritual might have been one of the forces that made settled life necessary. That does not mean Göbekli Tepe was a lost high-tech civilization erased by a flood. There is no evidence of steel, electricity, machines, forgotten cities beneath the hill, or a global empire directing construction from some vanished capital. The builders used stone tools. Their world was Neolithic, not modern. Their knowledge was different from ours, not necessarily greater. But not modern does not mean primitive. That word can hide more than it explains. A society without writing can still preserve vast amounts of knowledge. It can know the seasons, animal migrations, stone sources, medicinal plants, social alliances, sacred stories, landscape routes, and the exact skills needed to build monuments that survive for more than 11,000 years. It can transmit complex traditions orally through ritual, apprenticeship, repetition, and memory. And Göbekli Tepe was not alone. For a while it was presented almost like an isolated miracle. One impossible temple rising out of a world that was supposedly still waiting for civilization to begin. But discoveries across the wider region have changed that picture. Not far away are other early Neolithic sites that reveal an entire cultural landscape in transformation. At Navali Chori, now submerged beneath a reservoir, archaeologists found T-shaped pillars and communal buildings that strongly resemble the traditions seen at Göbekli Tepe. At Chayoni, people were building substantial structures, experimenting with new forms of settlement and moving toward the management of plants and animals. At Karahan Tepe, another site in the same southeastern Anatolian region, excavations have revealed stone pillars, carved human heads, animal imagery, and spaces that may have served ritual purposes. And there are more. Tash Tepela, meaning stone hills, is the name now used for a growing network of related sites across the region. Some are only beginning to be excavated. Some may prove smaller, later, or different in purpose than Göbekli Tepe. But together they tell us that this was not one isolated burst of genius. It was a world in which communities were gathering across the landscape. A world in which stone was being shaped into symbols. A world in which animals were not just hunted, but carved, remembered, feared, honoured, or transformed into sacred imagery. A world in which people were building places that seemed designed to bring separate groups together. And then something even stranger happened. Many of Göbekli Tepe's major enclosures were deliberately filled in. Not simply abandoned and buried by wind, filled with rubble, soil, broken stone, animal bone and debris. In some cases, the monuments seem to have been intentionally sealed by the very communities that built and used them. Why? Maybe the structures had completed their ritual life. Maybe new sacred spaces replaced old ones. Maybe changing social systems made the earlier enclosures unnecessary. Maybe the move toward permanent settlement and agriculture transformed the whole meaning of the site. We do not know, but deliberate burial tells us these people were not casually walking away from their past. They were making decisions about memory, closing one chapter, concealing, protecting, or retiring monuments that had mattered enough to build in the first place. This is where the phrase first civilization becomes complicated. If civilization means cities, states, writing, armies, taxation and kings, then Göbekli Tepe does not qualify. There is no evidence that it was a city-state, no surviving bureaucracy, no royal palace, no written archive listing its rulers, no proof of a centralized government controlling millions of people. But if civilization means something broader, large-scale cooperation, specialized knowledge, symbolic culture, shared institutions, monumental architecture, and the ability to organize human beings around ideas bigger than immediate survival, then Göbekli Tepe forces us to expand the definition. These were not people waiting for civilization to arrive. They were people creating some of the conditions from which civilization would later emerge. And that may be the real secret hidden in the stone circles. The past was not a clean staircase with hunter-gatherers on the bottom step and civilization waiting neatly at the top. Human history was messier than that. Communities experimented. They gathered, dispersed, built, abandoned, remembered, and started again. They created sacred centers before they created cities. They organized labor before they had kings. They made monuments before they had writing. Göbekli Tepe does not prove there was an advanced lost society before ours. It proves something more solid, and in its own way more astonishing. Long before the first dynasties, long before the first cities of Mesopotamia, humans had already learned how to turn belief into architecture. And once people learned to gather around shared symbols, shared rituals, and shared memories, the next stage of the story was almost inevitable. They would begin building not just temples for the dead, the animals, and the gods. They would begin building cities for the living, and that is exactly what happened on the plains between the Tigris and Euphrates. Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. Today, much of it lies within modern Iraq, with parts extending into Syria, Turkey, Iran and Kuwait. To ancient people, it was a landscape of extremes. Rivers that brought life through irrigation could also destroy entire settlements through sudden floods. Summers could bake the earth hard as fired clay. Rainfall was unreliable. Wood, stone and metal were scarce. By ordinary logic, this should have been a difficult place to build a civilization. Instead, it became one of the places where cities first appeared. Not overnight, not because one brilliant king woke up and announced that history was beginning. For thousands of years, communities in southern Mesopotamia had been experimenting with settled life. During the Ubaid period, beginning before 5000 BCE, villages grew around temples, canals, and cultivated fields. People learned to manage water in a world where water was both everything and a constant threat. That changed the equation. A farmer could grow more grain than one family needed. But only if canals were maintained, fields were measured, labour was organised, and harvests were stored. Suddenly, survival depended not just on what happened inside a household, but on whether hundreds or thousands of people could cooperate. And cooperation at that scale creates problems. Who keeps track of grain coming in and grain going out? Who decides which canal gets repaired first? Who distributes food during a bad year? Who owns the sheep, the land, the workshop, the temple storehouse? Who remembers the debt when one person owes another person 10 jars of barley 6 months from now? At first, the answers may have been simple. Clay tokens. Small shaped pieces representing goods. Sheep, grain, oil, cloth. A cone could mean one measure of grain. A sphere could mean something else. These tokens could be counted, sealed inside clay envelopes, and used to record obligations. But as society became more complicated, the old system began to break under its own weight. So people did something revolutionary. They started pressing symbols into wet clay. By around 3400 to 3200 BCE, in the great southern city of Uruk, those marks were becoming writing. Not literature at first, not philosophy, not poems about the meaning of life, spreadsheets, lists of barley rations, records of livestock, names of workers, deliveries of beer, temple inventories, bureaucracy carved into mud and baked hard by the sun. It sounds almost disappointingly ordinary, but this was one of the biggest transformations in human history. Before writing, knowledge had to live in people, in elders, storytellers, craft specialists, priests and families. If they died, if a community scattered, if a famine broke a chain of teaching, enormous amounts of information could disappear. Writing changed that. Now a promise could outlive the person who made it. A tax could be collected by someone who had never met the farmer who owed it. A ruler could command labour across a city too large to know every resident by face. A temple could keep accounts across generations. Memory had escaped the human mind and entered clay. Uruk became enormous by the standards of its time, perhaps home to tens of thousands of people at its height. It had districts, workshops, storehouses, defensive walls, and monumental temple platforms rising above the flat plain. The city was not just larger than earlier settlements. It was a new kind of machine, a machine made of mud brick, labour, grain, gods, debt, and administration. At the centre stood temples dedicated to deities, such as Inanna, goddess of love, war, and political power. These were not merely places where people went to pray. Temples were economic institutions. They controlled land, received offerings, organised labour, redistributed food, and helped turn the unpredictable cycles of river agriculture into a system people could survive inside. And then the cities multiplied. Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, each with its own god, rulers, rivalries, fields, canals, merchants, and claims to ancient authority. This was Sumer, the southern Mesopotamian world that later generations remembered as the place where kingship first descended from heaven. That phrase comes from the Sumerian king list, one of the strangest documents ever written. The king list names cities and rulers who supposedly held kingship before and after a great flood. Its earliest kings are assigned reigns so long they become almost impossible to imagine. One ruler is said to have reigned for 28,800 years, another for 36,000. Obviously, historians do not read those numbers as literal political records. They are part mythology, part ideology, part an attempt to create one continuous story out of many competing city-states. Different copies of the list disagree. Some rulers are historically attested. Others belong to a realm where legend and memory blur together. But the document matters because of what it preserves. It remembers a time before the flood, then it says the flood came. Then kingship was established again. This pattern appears again and again in Mesopotamian tradition. A world of early rulers, a catastrophic break, a new beginning, and nowhere is that memory more powerful than in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was probably based in part on a real king of Uruk who lived sometime around 2700 BCE, but the epic built around his name became far larger than history. In the story, Gilgamesh is a powerful ruler, part human and part divine, who loses his friend Enkidu and becomes terrified by death. He goes searching for Utnapishtim, a man who survived a flood sent by the gods and was granted immortality. Utnapishtim tells him the story. The gods decide to destroy humanity with a devastating flood. But the god Ea secretly warns one man. "Build a great boat," he says. "Bring your family, living creatures, and the seeds of life." The storm comes, the waters rise. Even the gods become frightened by the destruction. After days of chaos, the boat comes to rest. Birds are released to search for dry land. Finally, a sacrifice is offered, and the survivors begin again. If that sounds familiar, it should. The Mesopotamian flood tradition is older than the biblical story of Noah in its surviving written form, though the relationship between these traditions is still debated. Similar flood stories appear in the Atrahasis epic and in the Sumerian story of Ziusudra. They may preserve memories of real river floods, which were common and deadly in southern Mesopotamia. Or they may express something deeper, the fear that civilization itself is fragile, that the rivers feeding the cities can erase them. Maybe both. And this is where the ancient records become tantalizing. Mesopotamian scribes did not simply write down what happened yesterday. They copied old tablets, preserved royal inscriptions, recited myths, calculated eclipses, recorded omens, and organized the past into lists. For more than 3,000 years, scribal schools transmitted knowledge from generation to generation. They built mathematics around a base 60 system. That is why an hour has 60 minutes. A minute has 60 seconds, and a circle has 360 degrees. They could calculate areas, volumes, interest, and complex problems involving land and trade. Later, Babylonian astronomers tracked the motions of the moon and planets with astonishing precision, building predictive systems that could forecast lunar eclipses and recognize repeating celestial cycles. They also wrote laws. The Code of Hammurabi, carved around 1750 BCE, is the most famous example, though it was not the first. Earlier law codes, including that of Ur-Nammu, show rulers trying to define fines, property rights, marriage rules, injuries, debts, and punishment in writing. Justice was not always fair. These laws treated people differently according to rank, gender, and status. But they reveal a radical idea. Society could be governed by rules that were publicly declared, recorded, and remembered. This was not a lost technological civilization. There is no credible evidence that Sumerians had electricity, aircraft, advanced machines, or secret scientific knowledge beyond their age. Their cities were built from mud brick. Their workers suffered disease, war, debt, and hard labour. Their world was brilliant, but it was still ancient. Yet one question remains. When Mesopotamian scribes wrote about kings before the flood, were they inventing sacred prehistory? Almost certainly, at least in part. Were they preserving distorted memories of earlier settlements, disasters, and vanished traditions that had already become ancient by their time? That is entirely possible, after all. Uruk was not humanity's first experiment with building together. Göbekli Tepe had already stood abandoned for thousands of years. Farming villages had risen and changed across the Near East. Floods had buried settlements. Rivers had shifted. Whole communities had disappeared into the mud beneath newer cities. The scribes of Mesopotamia may not have possessed a secret archive from a forgotten supercivilization, but they understood something we often forget. Civilization does not begin once. It begins, collapses, remembers, rebuilds, and tells stories about what the waters took away. And if Mesopotamia was civilization shaped by rivers that could destroy it, Egypt was civilization shaped by a river that made the desert livable, the Nile. For most of its course, Egypt is a narrow green corridor surrounded by some of the harshest desert on earth. To the west, the Sahara. To the east, rugged mountains and the Red Sea. Northward, the river spreads into the broad delta before reaching the Mediterranean. Without the Nile, there is no Egypt, no wheat fields, no papyrus marshes, no great cities, no pharaohs, no pyramids rising above the desert. But Egypt did not suddenly appear when the first king put on a crown. Long before the dynasties, long before hieroglyphs covered temple walls, people had been living along the Nile Valley for thousands of years. They hunted, fished, gathered wild plants, raised cattle, buried their dead, traded across deserts, and slowly learned how to organize life around the river's annual rhythm. The Nile flooded every year, usually in late summer. Water from rains far to the south flowed northward, spread across the floodplain, and left behind dark, fertile silt. When the waters withdrew, farmers planted into soil renewed by the flood. It was one of the most reliable agricultural systems on the planet. Not perfectly reliable, a flood that was too low could mean famine. A flood that was too high could wash away homes and fields. But compared with the unpredictable rivers of Mesopotamia, the Nile offered a remarkable degree of order. And order became one of Egypt's deepest obsessions. Order in the seasons, order in society, order between gods and humans. Order against the ever-present threat of drought, disease, invasion, and death. The Egyptians had a word for it, Ma'at. Truth, balance, justice, cosmic order. The idea that the world worked only when everything remained in its proper place. But before Egypt became the kingdom of Ma'at, it was a patchwork of communities learning how to become something larger. By around 4400 BCE, the Badarian culture of Upper Egypt was producing finely made pottery, stone tools, ornaments, and carefully prepared burials. Their dead were often placed in graves with food, cosmetics, jewellery, and personal objects. That tells us something important. These people were not simply disposing of bodies. They were thinking about identity after death, status after death, perhaps a journey after death, and some graves were far richer than others. That difference matters because inequality is often one of civilization's earliest signals. When certain individuals are buried with rare materials, elaborate goods, imported stone, or ceremonial objects, it suggests that power is beginning to concentrate. Then came the Naqada culture, named after a site in Upper Egypt, where archaeologists uncovered evidence of increasingly complex pre-dynastic society. Between roughly 4000 and 3000 BCE, settlements grew. Craft production expanded. Cemeteries became more elaborate. Artists painted boats, animals, rituals, and human figures onto pottery. Leaders were buried with imported goods, carved pallets, ceremonial mace heads, ivory objects, and symbols that seemed designed to announce one message very clearly. This person mattered. Maybe they controlled land, maybe cattle, maybe trade routes, maybe religious ceremonies, maybe armed followers. Probably some combination of all of it, because Egypt was not isolated. Pre-dynastic Egyptians traded south into Nubia, east toward the Red Sea, west across desert routes, and northeast into the Levant. They obtained obsidian from distant regions, cedar wood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli ultimately originating far away in Central Asia, wine and olive oil from the eastern Mediterranean, gold from Nubia, and exotic materials that could be transformed into prestige. A small ivory carving or a jar of imported wine was not just an object. It was proof that somebody had connections beyond the horizon. And in a world where most people lived locally, control over long-distance exchange could become political power. This is where the familiar image of ancient Egypt begins to emerge. Not with pyramids, but with boats. Boats moved people and grain along the Nile. Boats linked villages separated by desert. Boats carried stone, timber, livestock, soldiers, officials, and tribute. They also carried the dead in religious imagination, because the gods themselves were thought to travel through the heavens by boat. The river was Egypt's highway, its calendar, its food supply, and eventually the backbone of a kingdom. Around 3200 BCE, the scattered regional centres of Upper and Lower Egypt began moving toward unification. Archaeologists can see the process in art and inscriptions. Rulers represented as larger than everyone else, enemies shown defeated, royal symbols repeated across objects, and writing beginning to appear on labels and seals. One of the most famous artifacts is the Nama palette. On one side, a king wearing the tall white crown of Upper Egypt raises a mace over a kneeling enemy. On the other, he wears the red crown associated with Lower Egypt. Above him, divine symbols watch over the scene. It may not record one literal battle exactly as it happened. Ancient royal art was propaganda long before the word existed. But its message is unmistakable. Many lands, one ruler. By about 3100 BCE, Egypt had become a unified state under the first dynasties. A king ruled from the Nile Valley, collected taxes, commanded labour, organised officials, controlled symbols, and linked political authority to the gods. This was not merely a larger village. It was a new machine like Uruk, but built along a river thousands of miles long. Grain moved into storehouses, goods were counted, workers were organised, royal names were written in early hieroglyphs, cemeteries became royal monuments. The king was no longer simply a powerful man. He was presented as the guardian of cosmic order itself, and later Egyptian tradition pushed that royal story even further back. Egyptian texts spoke of Zep-Tepi, the first time, a distant primordial age when gods ruled the earth and the foundations of the world were established. Later king lists included long sequences of human rulers, while some traditions, especially those recorded by the Egyptian priest Manetho in the Greek period, described eras when gods and semi-divine beings ruled before mortal pharaohs. To modern historians, these are not straightforward chronicles. They are sacred history. They explain why kingship existed, why temples mattered, why Egypt was supposed to be unified, and why the pharaoh stood between human society and divine order. Like the Sumerian king list, they turn the deep past into a political argument. Our rulers do not merely govern, they continue an order established at the beginning of time. And that is exactly why Egypt attracts so many claims about forgotten civilizations. The pyramids, especially the Great Pyramid at Giza, are so immense, so precisely constructed, and so old that some people insist conventional history cannot explain them. They claim the pyramids encode advanced mathematics, secret astronomical knowledge, lost energy technology, or messages from a civilization far older than dynastic Egypt. There is a kernel of truth hidden inside the exaggeration. The pyramid builders were extraordinary engineers. They surveyed land with remarkable accuracy. They aligned the Great Pyramid very closely to true north. They quarried, transported, shaped, and assembled millions of blocks of stone. They organised a labour force on a scale that required food, housing, medicine, administration, skilled craftspeople, and relentless planning. That achievement is real, but it does not require lost machines, aliens, or a vanished high-tech civilization. The evidence points to a human process we can actually trace. Earlier tombs became mastabas. Mastabas developed into stepped pyramids. The step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara was an experiment on a monumental scale. Later rulers built true pyramids, sometimes successfully, sometimes disastrously. The bent pyramid changes angle halfway up because its original design created structural problems. The collapsed pyramid at Meidum may preserve another failed attempt. That is not evidence of forgotten perfection. It is evidence of engineers learning. The pyramid builders had ramps, sledges, copper tools, stone pounders, wooden levers, surveying instruments, boats, and thousands of trained workers. Archaeological discoveries near Giza include workers' settlements, bakeries, animal bones, tools, administrative seals, and written records. The diary of an official named Mera even describes transporting limestone by boat for Khufu's pyramid project. The real story is more impressive than the fantasy. No hidden super-civilization had to appear from nowhere and hand Egypt a blueprint. Egyptian people, drawing on centuries of farming, trade, ritual, administration, stoneworking, and political organization, built structures so enormous that later ages could barely believe humans made them. But perhaps that disbelief tells us something. We are comfortable imagining ancient people as primitive because it makes our own age feel inevitable. Then we stand before a pyramid and suddenly the story breaks. We see precision, logistics, astronomy, architecture. A state powerful enough to mobilize an entire landscape. And we ask the wrong question. Not who gave them this knowledge, but how much knowledge can disappear when the people who created it are gone? Because Egypt's pharaohs inherited more than a river valley. They inherited thousands of years of experiments, rituals, tools, symbols, trade routes, and memories. And beyond the deserts, another civilization was rising beside another great river, building cities whose writing still refuses to speak to us. And beyond the deserts, another civilization was rising beside another great river, building cities whose writing still refuses to speak to us. Not in Egypt, not in Mesopotamia, in the vast floodplains of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. This was the Indus Valley civilization, also called the Harappan civilization after one of its first major archaeological sites. At its height, between roughly 2600 and 1900 BCE, it covered an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Its settlements stretched from the mountains of Afghanistan to the Arabian Sea, across the Indus River system and toward the plains of the Ganges. There were large cities, smaller towns, farming villages, trading ports, workshops, granaries, cemeteries and outposts scattered across a territory of perhaps 1 million square kilometers. This was not one city surrounded by empty land. It was an entire world, and its greatest cities were astonishing. Harappa in present-day Pakistan gave the civilization its modern name. Mohenjo-Daro, farther south along the Indus, may have held tens of thousands of people. Both cities were built with an order that still feels strangely modern. Their streets followed planned grids. Their bricks were made to standardized proportions. Houses often had wells, bathing areas, and drains. Wastewater flowed through covered channels beneath or beside streets. Some homes were modest, others were larger with multiple rooms and interior courtyards. But even ordinary neighborhoods show a level of urban planning that was extraordinary for the Bronze Age. Think about what that means. A drainage system is not just a ditch. It requires agreement. Somebody has to decide where streets go. Somebody has to establish building rules. Somebody has to ensure that one household's waste does not flood another household's doorway. Somebody has to organize labor, maintain public spaces, and enforce standards across thousands of buildings constructed over generations. In Mohenjo-Daro, archaeologists found what is often called the Great Bath, a large brick-lined tank carefully waterproofed with bitumen, reached by steps on either side. It may have been used for ritual bathing, civic ceremonies, or some activity we no longer understand. And that is the first warning with the Indus civilization. We can see the bricks, we can trace the streets, we can hold their tools, beads, seals, weights, pottery, toys and ornaments. But we cannot read the people who made them, unlike Egypt, where hieroglyphs tell us the names of kings, gods, officials, taxes, battles and prayers. The Indus Valley has left us a script that remains undeciphered. Thousands of short inscriptions survive, most on small carved seals. Many show animals, bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, water buffalo, and a strange creature sometimes called the unicorn, though it may be a stylized bull shown in profile. Above or beside these images are tiny signs, perhaps representing words, titles, names, goods, families, gods, or administrative offices. We do not know. There may be 400 signs, or fewer, depending on how variants are counted. The inscriptions are usually extremely short, a few symbols, sometimes only one. That creates a brutal problem. To decipher an ancient script, scholars usually need a breakthrough, a bilingual text, a long inscription, a known language hidden beneath the symbols, something like the Rosetta Stone, which gave scholars Greek beside Egyptian hieroglyphs. For the Indus script, nothing like that has been found. No long royal decree, no temple archive with thousands of readable tablets, no monument saying, "I am King so-and-so, and I built this city." The silence invites mystery, and mystery invites speculation. Some people claim the seals preserve evidence of an advanced lost civilization. Others insist they record an ancient form of Dravidian language. Some link them to early Indo-Aryan languages. Others argue the symbols may not represent full writing at all, but a system of emblems used for trade, ritual, clan identity, or administration. Scholars continue to debate all of it. The honest answer is not that the Indus people had no history. It is that their history is locked behind a door we have not yet opened. But even without reading their words, the physical evidence tells us they were deeply connected. Harappan craftspeople made beads from carnelian, shell, faience, copper and precious stones. Their standardized weights, often made from carefully shaped stone, suggest merchants and officials needed a shared system for measuring value and goods. A weight found hundreds of miles from its source still meant the same thing. It is trust made physical. Their trade reached Mesopotamia, where texts mention a distant land called Meluha. Many scholars believe Meluha was the Indus region. Mesopotamian cities imported carnelian beads, timber, ivory, shell, and other goods that may have come through Indus trade networks. Harappan merchants likely travelled by river, overland route, and sea across the Arabian Sea and Persian Gulf. This was not an isolated civilization, quietly growing beside one river. It was part of the Bronze Age world system, yet it organized itself differently from Egypt and Mesopotamia. Where are the giant palaces? Where are the royal tombs packed with gold? Where are the colossal statues of kings crushing enemies beneath their feet? They are mostly absent. There were elevated areas once called citadels, large public structures and evidence of social differences, but no obvious pharaohs, no clearly identified royal palace, no conqueror's monument announcing the destruction of rival cities. That does not mean the Indus Valley was peaceful, equal, or free of hierarchy. Absence of evidence is not evidence of a perfect society. Power may have been exercised through councils, merchant groups, priestly authorities, local elites, or institutions that left fewer dramatic monuments behind. But it does mean their civilization does not fit neatly into the familiar story. Not every complex society builds pyramids. Not every state worships a visible king. Then, around 1900 BCE, the great cities began to transform. The standardized urban system weakened. Long-distance trade declined. Large cities lost population. Settlements became smaller and more dispersed. The script disappeared from common use. The old brick standards faded. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were not simply erased overnight, but the civilization that had connected this enormous region changed beyond recognition. Why? For generations, people wanted one dramatic answer: an invasion, a catastrophic flood, a sudden collapse. But the evidence points to something more complicated. Climate change may have altered monsoon patterns and river flows. Some river systems shifted course. Floods damaged settlements in certain regions. Trade with Mesopotamia weakened as the wider Bronze Age world changed. Agricultural pressure, local political fragmentation, disease, and gradual migration may all have played a role. In other words, the Indus civilization may not have died in one apocalypse. It may have unravelled, city by city, trade route by trade route, generation by generation, and because we cannot read its final records, we do not know how its people understood what was happening. Did they see drought as a warning from the gods? Did officials struggle to maintain drainage systems and grain supplies? Did families abandon cities for villages because the old urban order no longer worked? Their seals do not tell us. Their script remains silent. That silence is a genuine mystery, but it is not a blank check for every extraordinary claim. An unread archive can make a civilization seem more supernatural than it was. We begin filling the gaps with lost machines, hidden empires, and secret knowledge because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. But the Indus Valley needs no fantasy to be remarkable. It built immense planned cities. It created sanitation systems that many later cities would envy. It standardized trade across enormous distances. It linked farmers, craftspeople, merchants, and administrators across a region larger than many ancient empires. And then much of its voice vanished. Not because it was unimportant, because history is fragile. A script can survive for 4,000 years and still remain unread. A civilization can leave millions of bricks, and yet conceal the names of the people who governed it, prayed in it, argued in it, loved in it, and watched it change. And as the cities of the Indus fell quiet, another civilization across the ocean was beginning to build something equally powerful. Not just cities, a system for measuring time itself. A system for measuring time itself. Across the ocean, in the forests, highlands, and coastal plains of Mesoamerica, people were building civilizations around an idea that still feels almost impossible in its ambition. Time was not just something that passed. Time was something you could calculate, track, predict, and perhaps, if the rituals were performed correctly, help keep in balance. Mesoamerica was not one empire, one people, or one language. It was a vast cultural world stretching through what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Over thousands of years, different societies rose, traded, fought, borrowed from each other, and built upon ideas older than any single kingdom. The Olmec came early. By roughly 1500 BCE, communities along Mexico's Gulf Coast were creating ceremonial centers at places like San Lorenzo and La Venta. They moved enormous blocks of basalt across difficult terrain, then carved them into colossal stone heads. Some of these heads weigh many tons. Their faces are individual, probably rulers or powerful ancestors, with helmets or elaborate headdresses and expressions that still seem intensely human. Who organized that labor? How did they feed the workers, move the stone, maintain the rituals, and hold together a society capable of shaping monuments on that scale? The Olmec left no library we can read, but they left evidence of hierarchy, long-distance trade, skilled craft production, and religious symbolism that would echo across Mesoamerica for centuries. Jaguars, serpents, maize, sacred mountains, supernatural rulers, and the idea that the human world was connected to a larger cosmic order. Some historians call the Olmec a mother culture because later traditions share certain themes with Olmec art. Others warn that the phrase oversimplifies things. Mesoamerica was not a civilization born from one source. It was a network. Many peoples were innovating, exchanging ideas, and developing their own traditions at the same time. Then came places like Monte Alban. High above the valley of Oaxaca, the Zapotec built a city on a leveled mountain summit beginning around 500 BCE. Imagine the effort. A mountain ridge reshaped into plazas, platforms, temples, tombs, and terraces. Below it lay several competing valleys. From the summit, its rulers could see the world they intended to govern. Monte Alban was not simply a religious site. It was a capital, a political statement carved into the landscape. Its monuments include inscriptions that may record conquered places, captives, dynasties, and ritual events. The Zapotec developed one of the earliest writing systems in the Americas, though much of it remains difficult to interpret. And farther east and south, the Maya were transforming mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and writing into something astonishingly precise. The ancient Maya did not suddenly appear in the great cities of the classic period. Their roots went back through earlier farming communities, village networks, and ceremonial centers. But by the first millennium CE, Maya cities such as Tikal, Palenque, Copan, Calakmul, and Caracol had become centers of population, power, art, and knowledge. They built pyramids that rose above the forest canopy. They carved royal histories into stone. They created palaces, reservoirs, causeways, ball courts, tombs, and plazas designed for crowds, ceremonies, and political theatre. But perhaps their greatest monument was invisible, a system of numbers and dates capable of reaching backward into the deep past and forward into futures no living king would ever see. The Maya used a base 20 counting system. They understood 0, represented in some contexts by a shell-like symbol, centuries before 0 became common in Europe. That matters because 0 is not just another number. It is an abstraction. It allows a mathematical system to mark an empty place, calculate enormous values, and organize time with extraordinary precision. Their calendar system combined multiple cycles. There was the 260-day sacred calendar, often called the Tzolkin. There was the 365-day solar year, the Harb. Together, these cycles interlocked in a larger pattern called the calendar round, repeating every 52 years. Then there was the long count. The long count recorded days from a mythic starting point, conventionally correlated by scholars to August 11, 3114 BCE. That date was not necessarily meant as a literal beginning of the physical universe. It marked the beginning of the current great era in Maya cosmology. And that distinction matters, because Mesoamerican time was often cyclical, but it was not simple repetition. Ages could begin, ages could end, worlds could be created, destroyed, and renewed. The universe moved through vast patterns, and human beings lived inside those patterns, responsible for maintaining their relationship with gods, ancestors, land, rain, maize, and the turning heavens. This is why later myths from the region speak of previous creations that failed. In the Quiche Maya Popol Vuh, preserved after the Spanish conquest from older traditions, the creators attempt more than once to make beings capable of honouring them. The first beings fail. another creation is destroyed. Humanity, in the final successful version, is made from maize. In central Mexican traditions recorded after conquest, the world passes through successive suns, each destroyed in a different catastrophe. Jaguars, wind, fire, flood. The details vary across sources and communities. These are religious stories, not geological reports. But they preserve a powerful idea. The world we inhabit may not be the first world. It may be the latest one. That idea has tempted some people to see Mesoamerican calendars as secret records of forgotten global civilizations. They point to precise astronomical observations, long cycles of time, pyramids aligned with celestial events, and myths of former ages. They argue this knowledge must have come from a vanished advanced culture, perhaps one connected to Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, or even Atlantis. But the evidence does not require that conclusion. Mesoamerican astronomers had centuries to observe the sky. They watched Venus rise and disappear. They tracked eclipses, solstices, lunar cycles, and the movement of planets. Their calculations were sophisticated because their intellectual traditions were sophisticated. Human beings do not need outside visitors or lost super-civilizations to become brilliant. Still, there is one question that keeps returning. Could there have been contact across the oceans? Claims of transoceanic contact appear constantly. Similar-looking pyramids, shared flood myths, the use of cotton, complex calendars, serpent gods, monumental stonework, and stories of bearded visitors arriving from the sea. Some writers treat these similarities as proof that ancient Egyptians, Phoenicians, Africans, Asians, or Atlanteans crossed the Atlantic or Pacific and transformed the Americas. The problem is that resemblance is not proof of contact. Pyramids are stable ways to build high with stone and earth. Flood myths emerge naturally in river societies and coastal cultures. Serpents are powerful symbols almost everywhere, and no accepted archaeological evidence shows sustained Old World contact with Mesoamerica before the Norse reached North America around 1000 CE. There may have been rare voyages that left no clear trace. History is full of surprises, but extraordinary claims need physical evidence, securely dated objects, genetic signatures, inscriptions, shipwrecks, or unmistakable traded materials. So far, that evidence has not appeared. What has appeared is something just as haunting, evidence of destruction. When Spanish forces and missionaries arrived in the 16th century, they did not enter an empty world. They encountered cities, states, markets, libraries, astronomers, poets, healers, and scribes. Indigenous peoples had recorded histories, tribute lists, rituals, dynasties, astronomical calculations, and sacred knowledge in painted books now called codices. Then many of those books were burned in 1562. The Franciscan bishop Diego de Landa ordered Maya religious objects and manuscripts destroyed in Yucatan. He later wrote that the Maya used books containing superstition and lies, and that he burned them all. From his perspective, he was destroying idolatry. From ours, he was helping erase an archive of human knowledge. Only a handful of pre-Columbian Maya codices survive today. The Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, a fourth, the Maya Codex of Mexico, whose authenticity was debated for years but is now widely accepted by specialists. That is all. Imagine trying to understand ancient Greece from 4 surviving books. Imagine reconstructing Egypt after burning nearly every papyrus. Imagine deciding whether a civilization possessed hidden knowledge when most of its own records were deliberately turned to ash. The mystery around Mesoamerica is not evidence that its people were magical strangers from a lost world. It is evidence that conquest can make a known world seem lost. Yet enough survived to show what they achieved. The Maya wrote histories in stone. Zapotec scribes marked power and place. Astronomers counted time across thousands of years. Builders raised cities from jungle and mountain. Farmers transformed landscapes through terraces, canals, raised fields, and careful knowledge of maize, beans, squash, water, and soil. They were keepers of time because they understood something many civilizations forget. A city can feel permanent, an empire can call itself eternal. But every calendar eventually reaches a date no one expected to see. And far to the south, beyond the forests and valleys of Mesoamerica, another world was proving that civilization could do something even more audacious. It could climb into the mountains and remake the earth itself. In the Andes, civilization did not spread across an easy river valley. It climbed from the Pacific coast, one of the driest places on earth, through fertile valleys and desert plains, up into mountain basins thousands of meters above sea level, across freezing plateaus, and down again into the eastern forests of the Amazon. This was a world of earthquakes, steep slopes, thin air, sudden frosts, violent rains, and landscapes that seemed designed to resist permanent settlement. And people built civilizations there anyway. Some of the oldest emerged along the coast of what is now Peru. At Caral, in the Supe Valley, monumental construction was underway by around 3000 BCE, making it one of the oldest known urban centers in the Americas. Caral had sunken circular plazas, pyramid-like platform mounds, carefully planned public spaces, and evidence of a society capable of organizing large-scale labor. It developed at roughly the same time as the first cities of Mesopotamia and Egypt. But it was not a copy of either. The people of Caral built their world around a different combination of resources: river valley farming, coastal fishing, trade, textiles, ritual and communal construction. They did not need metal tools, wheeled vehicles, or written texts in the forms familiar from the Old World to create monumental architecture. They had organization, they had knowledge, and they had enough confidence in the future to build structures meant to outlast the people who raised them. Centuries later, high in the mountains of Peru, Cavin de Huantar became a major ceremonial center. Beginning around 900 BCE, pilgrims may have travelled there from widely separated regions. Its architecture was strange and deliberate: sunken plazas, stone temples, internal galleries, drainage channels, and carved images of powerful beings that combined human, feline, bird, and serpent features. Inside, the complex water moved through hidden channels. During heavy flow, the sound may have echoed through the stone passages like the roar of an animal. Chavin was not an empire in the later Inca sense, but its art and religious symbols spread across a vast area. It shows that Andean societies were already connected by networks of pilgrimage, exchange, and shared ideas long before a single ruler claimed the mountains. Then came Tiwanaku, near the southern end of Lake Titicaca. At nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, Tiwanaku grew into one of the great centers of the ancient Andes. At that altitude, cold can destroy crops overnight. Oxygen is scarce. Weather shifts fast. Yet communities around the lake developed forms of agriculture designed specifically for this environment. They built raised fields, often called waru, long platforms of cultivated soil separated by water-filled canals. The canals helped moderate frost, retain moisture, and create productive farmland in difficult conditions. It was not magic, it was environmental intelligence, built through generations of observation. How does frost settle? Where does water collect? Which soils hold heat? How can a field become its own defense against the climate? Those questions were answered not in a laboratory, but in the earth itself. Tiwanaku's monuments are also among the most discussed in ancient technology speculation. At nearby Pumapunku, visitors see enormous stone blocks, sharply cut surfaces, deep channels and famous H-shaped stones that look almost machine-made. Some claim the precision is impossible without lost advanced technology, metal saws beyond the known record, or machines belonging to an earlier vanished civilization. But we do not immediately understand how it was done is not the same as it could not have been done. Archaeologists have found evidence of stoneworking traditions, quarrying, transport systems, abrasion techniques, hammerstones and skilled labour. Andes builders worked with stone for centuries. They learned how different rocks fractured, how surfaces could be smoothed, how joints could be shaped, and how thousands of people could be organised around a shared project. The unanswered questions are real. Exact methods for every block, every transport route, every stage of construction are not always known. But uncertainty should not become an excuse to erase indigenous achievement by assigning it to aliens, Atlanteans, or imaginary lost engineers. The builders were people, extraordinary people, and the Andean experiment kept expanding. The Wari state, centred in the highlands of present-day Peru between roughly 600 and 1000 CE, established planned provincial centres, road links, agricultural terraces, and systems of administration across wide territories. Long before the Inca, Andean societies were learning how to govern distance. Then the Inca took that knowledge to an astonishing scale. From their capital at Cusco, the Inca built Tawantinsuyu, the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas. Its road stretched perhaps 40,000 kilometres across mountains, deserts, valleys and high plateaus. Stone stairways crossed steep passes, rope bridges spanned river gorges. Way stations stored food, tools, textiles and supplies for travellers, officials, armies and messengers. The Inca did not conquer an empty landscape. They inherited traditions from Caral, Chavin, Tiwanaku, Wari, and countless local communities. Their genius was partly the genius of synthesis, gathering older systems of farming, labour, stonework, ritual, and administration, then connecting them into an empire. Their agricultural terraces turned mountain slopes into productive land. Their canals carried water across difficult terrain. Their stone buildings, fitted without mortar in places like Cusco and Machu Picchu, were designed to flex during earthquakes rather than simply resist them, and they preserved knowledge in forms Europeans often failed to recognize. The quipu was a system of chords, knots, colours, spacing and structure. Many quipus recorded numbers, census data, tribute, storehouses, labour obligations. But some scholars believe certain quipus may have carried narrative or historical information as well. We can read parts of their numerical logic. Much of the larger system remains undeciphered. Knowledge also lived in oral tradition, in ritual specialists, in elders, in songs, place names, farming practices, and stories passed from one generation to the next. When conquest shattered the Inca state, it did not erase all of that knowledge, but it damaged the networks that kept it alive. So when we stand before Pumapunku or look across the terraces of the Andes, the real mystery is not whether some forgotten super-civilization built them. The real mystery is how much human ingenuity can disappear from the record when its archives are chords, memories, landscapes, and voices that outsiders refuse to hear. And once you start taking oral tradition seriously, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Across the world, people remembered water, not just ordinary rain, not seasonal flooding. They remembered waters rising beyond the familiar boundaries of the world, rivers breaking their banks, seas swallowing land. Entire communities forced onto boats, mountains, rooftops, or whatever high ground they could reach. In Mesopotamia, one of the earliest centres of urban civilization, flood stories appear again and again. The Sumerian tale of Ziusudra, the Akkadian story of Atrahasis, and the famous flood episode in the Epic of Gilgamesh all describe a divine decision to destroy humanity with water. One survivor is warned. A great vessel is built. Animals and family are brought aboard. The flood comes, and afterward life begins again. These stories are older than the biblical account of Noah, though the traditions share obvious similarities. That does not prove one copied directly from another in every detail. But it does show that in the floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates, catastrophic water was not an abstract fear. It was reality. Mesopotamian cities lived beside rivers that gave them life, carried their trade, watered their crops, and could destroy them with terrifying speed. Archaeologists have found flood deposits at some ancient sites, layers of river sediment separating periods of settlement. Not one universal disaster layer covering the entire region at the same time, but evidence that floods could wipe out neighborhoods, fields, storehouses, and perhaps whole local kingdoms. To people living through one of those events, it may have felt like the end of the world, because their world was the land they knew, their city, their river, their people. The Mediterranean preserved its own memories of destruction by water. The Greeks told of Deucalion and Pyrrha, survivors of a great flood sent by Zeus. On Crete and nearby islands, later traditions developed around powerful sea disasters. And there is good reason those stories endured. The Mediterranean is a geologically violent place. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, coastal landslides and tsunamis have repeatedly reshaped its shores. Around 1600 BCE, the eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, was one of the largest volcanic events of the ancient world. It devastated the island and likely sent tsunamis across parts of the Aegean. It did not destroy every civilization in the Mediterranean, but for coastal communities watching walls of water race inland, the distinction would have mattered very little. In South Asia, flood memory runs through Hindu tradition. The story of Manu tells of a great flood, and a warning delivered by a fish, often identified with the god Vishnu. Manu builds a boat, survives the waters, and helps restore life afterward. Again, the setting matters. The Indian subcontinent contains some of the greatest river systems on Earth, the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and countless tributaries fed by monsoon rains and Himalayan snowmelt. These rivers sustain hundreds of millions of people. They also shift channels, overflow plains, and transform entire regions. The Indus civilization itself was built in a landscape shaped by changing rivers. Some settlements declined as water systems changed, monsoon patterns weakened, and channels migrated. No single flood explains the civilization's transformation, but environmental instability was part of the story. Across the Americas, flood traditions are equally widespread. Mesoamerican stories describe earlier worlds destroyed and remade. In the Popol Vuh of the Maya, a previous creation of wooden people is destroyed in a great flood. In the Andes, traditions recorded after the Spanish invasion describe waters covering the land before a new human order emerged. In North America, many indigenous nations preserved stories of floods, drowned lands, canoes, and ancestors reaching safety on mountains or high ridges. Then there is the Pacific. On islands scattered across the largest ocean on Earth, oral traditions often speak of land lost to the sea, of coastlines that once stretched farther outward, of people moving inland as waters rose. For a long time, outsiders treated such stories as mythology in the dismissive sense. Interesting, poetic, but not historical. Then scientists began mapping the drowned landscapes beneath modern seas. At the end of the last ice age, enormous sheets of ice covered northern continents. So much water was locked in glaciers that sea level stood more than 100 meters lower than it does today. Coastlines extended far beyond their modern limits. Areas now underwater were plains, river valleys, marshes, hunting grounds, and perhaps settlement zones. Then the ice melted, not in 1 week, not in 1 year, but over thousands of years, often fast enough to transform human lifetimes. Globally, sea level rose by roughly 120 metres between the height of the Ice Age and the mid-Holocene. In some periods, the rise accelerated dramatically. Low coastal plains vanished. Islands became smaller. Land bridges disappeared. Britain separated from continental Europe. Sunderland, the vast Ice Age landmass connecting much of Southeast Asia, fragmented into the islands we know today. The Persian Gulf basin flooded. Coastlines around every continent moved inland. Imagine living beside a valley your grandparents knew as dry land, then watching the sea advance generation after generation. Not like a movie, like a slow invasion. The salt water reaches the marshes, then the fields, then the old campsites, then the burial places. Then the stories become warnings. The sea used to be out there. Our ancestors lived where the fish swim now, and sometimes the disaster was not slow at all. Glacial lakes could burst through natural ice dams, releasing floods of almost unimaginable force. In North America, repeated outbursts from glacial Lake Missoula carved huge channels across the Pacific Northwest. In Asia and Europe, melting glaciers created unstable lakes capable of catastrophic collapse. Earthquakes generated tsunamis. Rivers changed course overnight. Monsoon failures could be followed by devastating rains. There may even have been dramatic flooding around the Black Sea basin as post-Ice Age waters rose, though the scale and timing of the proposed Black Sea deluge remain debated. So, do all these stories prove there was one single global flood? No, that conclusion goes beyond the evidence. Geology does not support a recent worldwide flood that covered every mountain and destroyed all humanity at once. Different flood stories emerged in different places, from different landscapes over vast spans of time. Mesopotamian river floods were not Pacific sea level rise. Aegean tsunamis were not Himalayan glacial lake outbursts. A flood in one valley can become a sacred memory without being a disaster everywhere else. But that does not make the stories meaningless. It may make them more interesting, because perhaps humanity did not preserve one literal memory of one global catastrophe. Perhaps it preserved a deeper pattern, generation after generation, confronting a changing planet, watching familiar ground disappear, learning that the stable world could become unstable with terrifying speed. Stories can exaggerate, they can merge separate events. They can turn natural forces into gods, warnings, punishments, and beginnings. But oral tradition can also carry real environmental knowledge across astonishing lengths of time, not as a perfect report as an echo. And if the first great settlements were often built near rivers and coasts, the places most vulnerable to flooding were also the places most likely to create civilization in the first place, which means some of humanity's earliest chapters may not be buried beneath sand or jungle. They may be beneath the sea, and beneath the sea, of course, lies the most famous lost land of all, Atlantis. For more than 2,000 years, people have searched for it. In the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, beneath the ice of Antarctica, along the coast of Spain, on the volcanic islands of Santorini. Some believe it was the first great civilization, technologically advanced beyond its time, wiped from history in a single catastrophic night. But the actual story begins with one man, Plato. Around 360 BCE, the Greek philosopher wrote 2 dialogues called Timaeus and Critias. In them, an elderly Athenian politician named Critias tells a story he says had been passed down through his family. His ancestor Solon, one of Athens' most respected lawmakers, supposedly heard it from Egyptian priests at the city of Sighs. The priests told Solon that Athens was far older than the Greeks remembered, and they told him about a powerful island empire called Atlantis. According to Plato, Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the ancient Greek name for the Strait of Gibraltar. It was a large island, richer and more powerful than any kingdom in the known world. Its capital was built in circles of land and water, connected by bridges and canals. It had vast harbours, fertile plains, palaces, temples, armies, elephants, and a navy capable of threatening the Mediterranean. At first, the Atlanteans were noble. They carried something divine within them. But wealth changed them. They became greedy, imperial, drunk on power. They began conquering lands across Europe and Africa. Then, Plato says, they turned toward Athens. But ancient Athens, still virtuous and uncorrupted, stood against them. It led a coalition, defeated the invading empire, and saved the free peoples of the Mediterranean. Then came the ending, violent earthquakes, massive floods. In a single day and night of terrible misfortune, the Athenian army vanished into the earth. Atlantis sank beneath the sea, and that is where the mystery begins. Because Plato presents the story with an unusual level of detail, specific places, specific family names, a date 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt. Not merely a tale about gods and monsters, but something that sounds almost like history. Almost. But Plato was not writing history in the modern sense. He was writing philosophy. His Atlantis story appears in dialogues about the nature of the universe, the ideal state, human morality, and political decline. The Athens in the story is not the messy, real Athens of Plato's own time. It is an idealized Athens, disciplined, selfless, united, and brave. Atlantis is its opposite, rich, powerful, expansionist, and morally rotten. It is a warning disguised as a lost civilization. Plato had watched Athens suffer war, political chaos, and defeat. He knew what happened when democratic states became ambitious empires. In Atlantis, he may have been holding up a mirror to Greece itself, especially Athens at the height of its imperial power. The lesson was brutal. A civilization can have wealth, ships, monuments, and military power. It can dominate its neighbours and believe it is chosen by the gods. And still, if it loses its discipline, its justice, and its limits, it can destroy itself. That does not mean Plato invented every part of the story from nothing. Writers often build fiction from real places, real disasters and memories already circulating in their culture. And the ancient Mediterranean had plenty of disasters to remember. The most famous candidate is Santorini, known in the Bronze Age as Thera. Around 1600 BCE, Thera experienced a colossal volcanic eruption. The island exploded with a force that reshaped its geography. Ash spread across the Aegean. Tsunamis struck nearby coastlines. The eruption devastated the local settlement at Akrotiri, a sophisticated town with multi-story buildings, painted walls, drainage systems, and evidence of far-reaching trade. Nearby Crete was home to the Minoans, one of the great civilizations of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Their palaces, fleets, art, and trading networks made them seem almost legendary to later Greeks. The eruption did not instantly erase Minoan civilization, but it likely damaged coastal settlements, disrupted trade, and weakened a world already facing political and economic pressures. So the theory has real strengths: a powerful island culture, a catastrophic volcanic event, tsunamis, a civilization remembered long after its decline. It is easy to see how fragments of such a disaster could survive in story. But there are problems. Santorini is inside the Mediterranean, not beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. It was far smaller than Plato's enormous Atlantis. The eruption happened roughly 1,000 years before Plato, not 9,000, and the Minoans were not a world-conquering empire that attacked Athens, especially since Athens as described by Plato did not exist at that time. So Santorini may explain pieces of the Atlantis image. Not the whole story. Others have looked west. Some place Atlantis near Iberia, in southern Spain, where the ancient culture of Tartessos flourished near the Guadalquivir River. This region had wealthy trading centres, access to the Atlantic, and landscapes altered by floods, earthquakes and shifting coastlines. Some researchers have even searched the marshlands near Doñana National Park for traces of a lost city. Others point farther into the Atlantic, the Azores, the Canary Islands, Madeira or submerged banks and ridges on the ocean floor. But no archaeological evidence has confirmed a Bronze Age, let alone Ice Age, Atlantic supercivilization. And then there is Antarctica. The idea that Atlantis lies beneath Antarctic ice usually depends on claims that the continent shifted suddenly from a warmer location, or that ancient maps show its coast before it froze. Those claims do not hold up under geology. Antarctica has been ice-covered for millions of years, long before human civilization, and there is no credible evidence of a lost human empire beneath its ice. The deeper problem is simple. If Atlantis was a global civilization with huge cities, vast armies, advanced engineering, and international influence, we would expect evidence. Ruins, tools, graves, inscriptions, trade goods, genetic traces, something that could be dated, tested, compared, and independently confirmed. So far, we have none of that. No archaeological consensus identifies Atlantis as a real, lost global civilization. But maybe that is not why the story has survived. Maybe Atlantis endures because it gathers together fears that every civilization understands. The sea rising, the earth shaking, great cities collapsing, power becoming arrogance, knowledge disappearing, a people who thought they were permanent discovering that permanence was an illusion. And after Plato's island sinks beneath the waves, another question rises from the deep. What if ancient people did not remember one vanished super-civilization? What if they remembered something even more unsettling? That civilizations are not a straight line upward. They are cycles. And once you start looking for them, cycles are everywhere. Not just in one culture, not just one myth. Across continents, across thousands of years, human societies kept returning to the same unsettling idea. The world has ended before, not the planet, not necessarily every living thing, but the human world, the ordered world, the age of cities, laws, ancestors, sacred knowledge, and familiar skies. It rises, it flourishes, it weakens, it breaks. Then somehow another beginning emerges from the ruins. In Hindu traditions, this idea reaches a scale almost impossible to comprehend. Time is not a straight road moving from a primitive past toward a better future. It is a wheel, vast ages turning through creation, decline, destruction, and renewal. These ages are called Yugas. The first is the Satya Yuga, sometimes called the Golden Age. It is the age of truth. Human beings are said to live in harmony with cosmic order. Virtue is complete, knowledge is clear, life is long. The world has not yet become divided by greed, conflict, or deception. Then comes the Treta Yuga. Something begins to change. Righteousness remains, but it no longer stands on all four legs, as the old image puts it. It has weakened. Human life becomes more complicated. Sacrifice, hierarchy, struggle, and ambition enter the story. After that comes the Dvapara Yuga. Virtue declines further. Strength and wisdom still exist, but they are contested. The great epics of India, especially the Mahabharata, are traditionally placed near the end of this age. Heroes walk the earth, gods intervene, but the world is already moving toward fracture. And finally comes the Kali Yuga, the age we are said to be living in now. In the Kali Yuga, truth is harder to recognize. Wealth becomes confused with worth. Power replaces wisdom, families divide, leaders become corrupt, memory shortens. The world does not necessarily end in one explosion. It decays from within, one broken promise, one forgotten lesson, one act of greed at a time. It is a grim picture, but it has an ending. When decline reaches its limit, the cycle resets. A new age begins. The world is renewed. Truth returns. Now, it is important to understand what this means. The traditional Hindu calculations assign enormous lengths to the yugas, stretching into millions of years when read in their classical cosmological form. These are not archaeological dates. They are not a hidden calendar, proving that an advanced civilization existed in the Ice Age. They belong to mythic time. And mythic time works differently from history. History asks what happened, where, when, and what evidence remains. Myth asks a different question. What kind of world do we live in? Why does goodness decline? Why do societies forget what they once knew? Why do people keep rebuilding the same systems, making the same mistakes, and calling it progress? The Greeks asked similar questions. The poet Hesiod described a sequence of human ages: gold, silver, bronze, the age of heroes and iron. Like the Yugas, the Greek ages move from an earlier world of abundance and closeness to the gods toward a harsher age of labour, violence, and moral confusion. And Hesiod made it personal. He believed he lived in the Iron Age, an age where children dishonoured parents, guests betrayed hosts, brothers turned against brothers, and justice could be bought by the powerful. Sound familiar? Across the Atlantic, Mesoamerican traditions also imagined successive creations. In the Maya Popol Vuh, earlier attempts to create humanity fail before the beings of maize are finally made. In Aztec cosmology, the world passes through a series of suns, each destroyed in a different catastrophe. Jaguars, wind, fire, flood. The present world is not the first world. It is the latest one. Fragile, temporary, waiting for its own ending. Even the Norse had Ragnarok. A final collapse of gods and monsters, fire and flood, followed not by permanent nothingness, but by a renewed earth rising again. Different names, different gods, different landscapes, but the pattern keeps returning. An earlier age was greater. Something was lost. The present age is diminished. And destruction is not the final chapter. It is the doorway to another beginning. So were these stories preserving memories of real geological disasters. Some modern researchers have tried to find the clock hidden inside the myths. They connect world-age traditions to the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that completes a cycle roughly every 26,000 years. Others point to ice ages, sea level rise, volcanic eruptions, solar cycles, or the periodic impacts of comets. There is a temptation here. Ancient numbers can be astonishingly large and mathematically elaborate. Astronomical cycles are real. Climate has changed dramatically. Civilizations have been hit by floods, droughts, eruptions, and sudden cold. Maybe, people argue, the myths are coded science. Sometimes there may be a grain of truth in that. Ancient societies watched the sky with extraordinary patience. They tracked eclipses, solstices, planets, and seasonal change for generations. They knew that the heavens moved in patterns long before modern astronomy gave those patterns equations. But recognizing the sky is cyclical is not the same as possessing a secret record of forgotten industrial civilizations, and matching myths to modern scientific events can become dangerously easy. Give someone enough numbers, enough symbols, enough disasters, and they can make almost any tradition appear to predict almost anything. The stronger possibility is more human. Civilizations imagine lost golden ages because decline is visible. A farmer sees exhausted soil, a citizen sees corruption, an elder watches old customs disappear, a survivor walks through the ruins of a city that once seemed eternal. And from that experience comes a terrible conclusion. Maybe we are not the beginning. Maybe we are what remains after something greater has already fallen. That idea can preserve humility. It can also create nostalgia, the belief that the past was purer simply because it is unreachable. Every age invents its own golden age, not always because one truly existed, but because the present feels unstable and the future feels uncertain. Still, there is one place where cycles stop being mythic, at the edge of the sea. Because while ancient storytellers imagined worlds destroyed by flood, modern geology tells us something equally dramatic. At the end of the last ice age, the oceans rose more than 120 meters, and entire human landscapes disappeared beneath the water. And this is not a metaphor. At the height of the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, so much water was locked up in continental ice sheets that global sea level was more than 120 meters lower than it is today. The coastlines we know now did not exist. The Persian Gulf was a broad river valley. Southeast Asia was connected by vast lowland plains. Britain was not an island. Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania were joined into a single enormous landmass called Sahul. And between Britain and mainland Europe lay a country that is now completely gone. Doggerland. Today the North Sea looks like an empty stretch of water separating England from Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany and Norway. But for thousands of years it was dry land. Not one small island, not a narrow land bridge. A huge and changing landscape of rivers, marshes, forests, lakes and rolling plains. People lived there. They hunted red deer and wild cattle. They gathered plants along the wetlands. They fished the rivers. They made camps beside lakes that no longer exist. Archaeologists have recovered stone tools, animal bones, fragments of worked wood, and even ancient peat from the floor of the North Sea. Fishing boats have dragged up harpoons made from bone. Survey vessels mapping the seabed have found the buried channels of rivers that once crossed the vanished plain. Doggerland was not Atlantis. It was not a lost super-civilization with crystal towers and impossible machines. But it was a real human world, and the sea swallowed it. Not necessarily in one single day. In many places the water arrived slowly, generation by generation. A shoreline moved inland. A freshwater marsh became brackish. A familiar hunting ground became an island. An island became a sandbar. Families who had lived near one river for centuries may have watched the river widen into an estuary, then vanish beneath the tide. But there were also moments of sudden violence. Around 8,200 years ago, a massive underwater landslide off Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, triggered a tsunami across parts of the North Atlantic. Evidence suggests waves struck the low-lying remains of Doggerland. By then, much of the landscape was already drowning. The tsunami may have been one more devastating blow against communities trying to survive on shrinking ground. Imagine what that would do to memory. Your grandparents tell you where the old forest stood. Your parents remember fields beyond the marsh. You grow up watching those places disappear. Then a great wave comes, and the last familiar landmarks are gone. A flood story does not need to begin with fantasy. Sometimes it begins with geography, and Doggerland is only one example. Along the Mediterranean coast, archaeologists have found settlements now lying beneath the water. At Atlit Yam off the coast of Israel, A Neolithic village dating back roughly 9,000 years preserves stone-built structures, burials, wells, and evidence of early farming and herding. People once lived there on dry land beside freshwater springs. Today it sits under the sea. Near the coast of southern Greece lies Pavlopatri, an ancient submerged town with streets, buildings, courtyards, and tombs. Its visible remains are much later than the Ice Age, but the lesson is the same. Coastlines are not permanent. A place can be a living community, then a ruin, then a rumour beneath the waves. Near India, the story becomes more controversial. Off the coast of Gujarat, researchers working in the Gulf of Hambat reported possible submerged structures, stone artefacts, and material that some interpreted as evidence for a very ancient settlement. The claims received enormous attention. Could a city older than the earliest known urban centres be lying underwater? Maybe, but the evidence remains disputed. The Gulf has strong currents, shifting sediments, and complex geology. Objects recovered from the seabed are difficult to connect securely to a specific human-built site. Some dates may come from ancient wood or organic material carried there by rivers, not from a drowned city itself. Archaeology depends on context. A tool found in place, inside a buried floor or wall, tells us far more than an object lifted from disturbed sediment. That does not mean India has no submerged archaeology. Far from it, offshore investigations near Dwarka have revealed remains connected to historic and prehistoric coastal activity. India's long shoreline has always been vulnerable to changing sea levels, storms, earthquakes, and shifting river mouths. There may be many sites still waiting beneath the Arabian Sea and Bay of Bengal, but their maybe is not the same as we have found a lost Ice Age civilization. Then there is Yonaguni. Off the southern coast of Japan, divers discovered a dramatic underwater rock formation near Yonaguni Island. It has terraces, sharp edges, broad flat surfaces, apparent steps and shapes that look uncannily like walls or platforms. To some observers, it resembles the remains of a monumental structure. A sunken temple, a fortress, a city carved from stone before the sea rose. Others see something very different. Yonaguni is made of sandstone and mudstone layers that naturally fracture along straight plains. Earthquakes, waves, erosion, and collapse can produce surfaces that look startlingly geometric. Most geologists consider the formation largely natural. Some researchers have suggested that people may have modified parts of it, perhaps using a natural formation as a quarry, ritual site, or landmark. But there is no broad scholarly agreement that Yonaguni is a constructed monument, and no confirmed artifacts or secure archaeological context proving an ancient city. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story, it is the story. Underwater archaeology is difficult in ways, land archaeology is not. Currents scatter evidence, sediment buries it, salt water erodes it. Diving is expensive, dangerous, and limited by time. And the deepest drowned coastlines, the ones exposed when sea level was at its lowest, may now lie far offshore beneath dozens of meters of water. For most of human existence, people were drawn to coasts, rivers, estuaries, and lakes. These places offered fish, shellfish, birds, fresh water, transport routes, and rich soils. But because modern oceans cover so much of those ancient shorelines, our archaeological map has a built-in blind spot. We have been searching for early human history mostly on the land that survived, which means the apparent emptiness of the distant past may be partly an illusion, not proof of 6 forgotten global civilizations, not evidence that archaeologists are hiding ancient empires beneath the waves, but a serious reason for caution when we tell the story of where civilization began. The first villages, the first coastal migrations, the first experiments in trade, fishing, boat building and settlement may have happened in places now erased from the visible world. And if the sea took the homes, the graves, the tools and the roads, what else did it take? Maybe not a vanished technological paradise, but perhaps the missing chapters of humanity's earliest beginnings. And once you accept that entire landscapes can disappear beneath the sea, another question becomes almost unavoidable. What if the missing chapters were not just villages, campsites and fishing grounds? What if they contained technologies we no longer understand? This is where the argument gets dangerous, because ancient technology is real. It is often astonishing, and when people underestimate what ancient engineers could do with stone, wood, rope, copper, bronze, iron, fire, water and organised labour, they can start looking for an explanation that feels more dramatic. Lost machines, forgotten industrial civilizations, tools so advanced that they leave no trace except the monuments themselves. You have probably seen the claims. Granite blocks cut with impossible precision, holes drilled through hard stone that supposedly require modern machinery, walls in Peru where massive polygonal blocks fit so tightly that you cannot slide a blade between them, stones at Baalbek in Lebanon weighing hundreds, even more than 1,000 tons, moved into place without cranes, engines or steel. The monuments are real. The mystery is how much mystery they actually require. Take ancient Egyptian stonework. At sites like Giza, Saqqara and Aswan, builders shaped limestone, granite, basalt and other difficult materials with extraordinary skill. Granite is especially impressive. It is much harder than copper. So how could workers using copper tools carve it, polish it and drill into it? The answer is not that copper somehow became stronger than granite. The answer is abrasion. A copper saw or tube drill does not need to slice through stone like a modern steel blade. It can carry an abrasive, especially quartz-rich sand, which is harder than the stone being worked. Add water, pressure, repeated motion, and enormous patience, and the abrasive does the cutting. The copper provides the shape and the force, the sand does the grinding. Experimental archaeologists have demonstrated versions of these methods. Not quickly, not effortlessly, but successfully. And that word matters. Successfully. Ancient engineering was rarely about one worker with one tool. It was about systems, teams of specialists, quarry workers, rope makers, carpenters, surveyors, stone dressers, food suppliers, administrators recording rations and schedules. A monument that looks impossible when imagined as a lone genius with a hammer becomes more understandable when imagined as a state project employing thousands of trained people over decades. The Great Pyramid did not rise because Egyptians had secret laser cutters. It rose because ancient Egypt had organization on a scale few modern people ever picture. They understood measurement, they understood slopes, load distribution, leverage, transport, and the behavior of stone. They could quarry blocks, move them by sledges, reduce friction with water on sand, haul them using ropes and position them through methods that are still debated in their exact details. Ramps probably played a role, though scholars continue to argue over what kind of ramps were used and when. Not knowing every step is not the same as having no explanation. That distinction is one of the most important rules in archaeology. Then there are the giant blocks. At Baalbek, enormous stones were cut from nearby quarries for a Roman-era temple complex. Some were transported and raised into courses high above the ground. The largest unfinished stones left in the quarry are so huge that they almost seem designed to provoke conspiracy theories. Surely people say no ancient society could move something like that, but the Romans were not primitive builders. They created roads across continents, aqueducts that carried water over vast distances, concrete harbours, domes, cranes, treadwheel lifting devices, and machines powered by human and animal labour. Their engineers wrote about pulleys, gears, winches, and lifting systems. Moving a gigantic block was brutally difficult. It required planning, timber, rollers or sledges, capstans, ropes, ramps, and a huge labour force. But difficult is not impossible. The fact that one of the biggest stones was abandoned in the quarry may actually show the limits of their technology, not evidence of machinery beyond it. And in the Andes the stonework is no less impressive. At Cusco, Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, and Machu Picchu, Inca builders created walls from irregular blocks fitted with incredible care. The joints twist around corners. Stones interlock. Some walls survived earthquakes that shattered later colonial construction. How did they do it? Probably through repeated testing, grinding, hammering, fitting, marking, and refitting. A block could be moved into position, checked against its neighbour, removed, reshaped, and tested again. It is slow. It is labour-intensive. It demands expertise that takes years to master. But it does not demand a lost machine age. The uncomfortable truth is that we often underestimate ancient people because their methods are unfamiliar to us. We live in a world of electric saws, digital measurements, hydraulic cranes, and factory-made parts. We see an ancient wall and assume that without our machines its builders must have had something even more advanced. Maybe the real answer is less flattering to us. Maybe they had skills we no longer practice because we replaced them with machines. There is, however, one artifact that proves ancient technology could be far more sophisticated than anyone expected. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera. This corroded mass of bronze fragments looked at first like little more than scrap. But when researchers examined it closely, they found gears. Dozens of precisely made bronze gears, dials, inscriptions, and mechanical relationships designed to track astronomical cycles. It could model the movements of the sun and moon. It could predict eclipses. It tracked calendars and planetary cycles with a complexity not seen again in surviving devices for more than 1,000 years. This was not a modern computer. It had no electricity. No microchips, no hidden power source. But it was a real analog machine built around the 2nd or 1st century BCE, and it changed how historians viewed ancient Greek engineering. It showed that sophisticated mechanical knowledge could exist, flourish, and then vanish from the surviving record. That is the lesson worth holding on to. Not that every precise stone joint proves a lost civilization with impossible technology. But that history is full of surprises. Knowledge can be concentrated in small groups. Techniques can disappear when states collapse, workshops close, trade networks break apart, or the people who understand a craft are killed, displaced, or simply not replaced. A lost technology does not have to mean flying machines or industrial factories. Sometimes it means a particular way of cutting stone, a formula for concrete, a method of navigation, a mechanical design, a body of knowledge written on wood, cloth, wax, or papyrus that rots away while the stone monuments remain. And that raises an even stranger possibility. If a single corroded device from a shipwreck can rewrite what we thought ancient engineers knew, how many other mysteries are waiting in the places we have not yet searched? And that is exactly why unexplained mysteries matter. Not because every gap in the record is evidence of Atlantis. Not because every strange artifact proves a forgotten super-civilization. Not because historians are hiding the truth in locked vaults somewhere beneath the Vatican, the British Museum, or a desert temple. Mysteries matter because history is incomplete, and incomplete does not mean imaginary. It means there are questions worth asking. Questions like why Göbekli Tepe appeared so early, with monumental stone architecture built by people who were still largely hunters and gatherers. Why the script of the Indus Valley remains unread after more than a century of study. Why the builders of the Great Pyramid complex achieved such extraordinary precision, while so much of the paperwork, planning, and daily knowledge behind their work has vanished. Why the Maya recorded time with astonishing complexity, yet entire libraries of their books were burned or destroyed. Why ancient sailors crossed open water long before most people imagined they could. Why so many flood traditions preserved memories of a world transformed by water. Each mystery has possible explanations. Some are stronger than others. Some will probably be solved by a new excavation, a better dating method, a fragment of text found in the right place, or an inscription finally understood. Others may remain open forever. That is not a failure of history. It is part of what makes history honest. The past is not a neat archive waiting for us to open it. It is a crime scene almost completely exposed to weather. It has been flooded, burned, buried, looted, rebuilt, farmed over, quarried and swallowed by cities. Organic materials decay. Wooden buildings rot. Cloth disappears. Papyrus turns to dust. Spoken languages die with the last people who know them. Even stone breaks eventually. What survives is not necessarily what was most important. It is what happened to be durable, buried, remote, lucky, or repeatedly copied. Think about that for a second. If our own civilization vanished tomorrow, what would a distant future archaeologist find? Maybe concrete foundations, plastic fragments, a few satellites falling from the sky. Perhaps some sealed data centers, though without electricity, software, passwords, and the languages needed to interpret them. They might be as unreadable as the Indus signs are to us now. Would they understand the internet from a broken phone? Would they reconstruct modern medicine from a corroded surgical tool? Would they know what most people believed, feared, loved, or argued about? Probably not. They would have clues. Extraordinary clues. But clues are not the same as the whole story. That is the lens we should bring to the 12 unexplained mysteries explored beyond this video. Not blind belief, not cynical dismissal. Curiosity with standards. There are ancient structures whose purpose is still debated. Artifacts whose exact function remains uncertain. Maps, inscriptions, vanished cities. Strange burials, submerged ruins, and technologies that seem to arrive earlier than expected. Some mysteries may reveal forgotten local traditions. Some may expose how much knowledge has been lost. Some may turn out to have perfectly ordinary explanations once enough evidence is found. And a few may force us to redraw the map of human history. If you want to go deeper into those 12 mysteries, the channel's book is available through the website link in the description. It explores the sites, artifacts, historical puzzles, and competing explanations in much more detail, including what we know, what we only suspect, and where the evidence stops. Because that last part is crucial. Where does the evidence stop? This is the question that separates a real historical mystery from a story that can explain anything. A claim that humanity had advanced civilizations before the known ones would need more than an impressive wall, a legend about a flood, or a stone block that seems too heavy to move. It would need evidence that can survive serious scrutiny. We would need securely dated settlements from the right period. Not an artifact found loose in disturbed soil, but a site with clear layers, clear context, and materials that can be independently tested. We would need writing, or at least repeated symbolic systems that show administration, mathematics, or a complex shared culture. We would need tools, workshops, waste materials, trade goods, food remains, burials, and the ordinary debris that every real society produces. Civilizations leave messes, they leave broken pots, fire pits, quarry marks, slag from metalworking, storage areas, roads, trash heaps, animal bones, seeds, drains, repairs built on top of repairs. Evidence of people living, trading, governing, fighting, celebrating and dying. A true lost civilization would not reveal itself through one perfect object. It would appear as a pattern, and the more advanced the claim, the larger and clearer that pattern should be. A global industrial civilization would leave enormous chemical and geological signatures. Mining scars, pollution, manufactured materials, vast changes to landscapes. A seafaring culture would leave ports, boat technology, coastal settlements, trade networks, and genetic connections. A literate state would leave records, seals, standardized measures, and administrative traces. Some of that evidence may be underwater now. Some may be buried beneath modern cities. Some may have been destroyed beyond recovery. But if it existed at a truly large scale, we should expect to find more than hints. That does not close the case. It tells us where to look. And maybe that is the deeper lesson behind the idea that we are the seventh civilization. The number itself may be too simple. Human history was never 6 clean chapters followed by us. It was thousands of communities, cultures, migrations, inventions, collapses, and recoveries overlapping across time. But the warning inside, the idea is real. No civilization is guaranteed to preserve itself. Knowledge can vanish, cities can disappear, entire ways of life can become almost invisible within a few generations. The question is not whether the past contains mysteries. It obviously does. The question is whether we are willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when the answer is stranger than we expected, and even when it is more ordinary than the legend. And history gives us plenty of examples, not of civilizations simply disappearing overnight, like someone switched off the lights. Real collapse is usually slower, messier, and more human than that. A city may burn, a king may fall, a trade route may close. But the people do not vanish. They flee, adapt, merge with neighbours, change languages, abandon old customs, and carry whatever they can into a different world. What disappears first is often not the population. It is the system that held everything together. Think about what a civilization actually depends on. Reliable food, water, roads, trade, labour, shared rules. People who know how to build, calculate, heal, navigate, govern, store grain, settle disputes, and pass all of that knowledge to the next generation. As long as those systems keep working, a society can seem permanent. Its monuments rise, its officials write records, its markets fill with goods from distant lands. Its people start assuming the world will continue tomorrow, much like it did today. Then pressure begins to build. Maybe rainfall changes. A drought lasts not 1 season, but 10. Crops fail. Herds die. Rivers shift their courses. Maybe the opposite happens. Floods tear through fields and settlements. Volcanic eruptions darken the sky. Earthquakes destroy canals, ports, and storehouses. Environmental stress does not automatically destroy a civilization. Strong societies can adapt. They move crops, ration food, dig new wells, change trade routes. But adaptation costs resources, and when a society is already stretched thin, one crisis can trigger another. Food shortages create unrest. Unrest weakens governments. Weak governments struggle to collect taxes, armies go unpaid, borders become vulnerable, trade becomes dangerous. Then disease spreads through hungry populations moving from place to place. A problem that began with weather becomes a political crisis, a military crisis, a public health crisis, and finally a crisis of belief. People begin asking the most dangerous question any ruling class can face. Why are you still in charge if you cannot protect us? Around 1200 BCE, much of the eastern Mediterranean entered exactly this kind of breakdown. The great Bronze Age kingdoms had been connected by trade networks stretching from Egypt and the Levant to Anatolia, Cyprus, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean. Palaces depended on imported copper, tin, timber, luxury goods, grain, and diplomatic alliances. It was an ancient international system, complex, wealthy, and highly connected, which also made it fragile. When drought, migration, warfare, internal rebellions, and disrupted trade hit in overlapping waves, palace after palace fell. Mycenaean centres burned. Hittite power collapsed. Cities along the Levantine coast were destroyed or abandoned. Egypt survived, but barely, and emerged weaker. Writing systems used by palace bureaucracies disappeared from some regions for centuries. Now, that does not mean everyone died, or that knowledge vanished completely. Farmers remained, villages continued, craftspeople adapted. Oral traditions survived. New cultures emerged from the ruins. But the centralized world of palaces, scribes, long-distance trade, and elite administration was broken, and with it went specialized knowledge that depended on those institutions. A palace archive is not just a room full of tablets. It is a living machine. Scribes must be trained, clay must be prepared. Languages must be understood, records must be copied. Officials must know which symbols matter, which taxes are due, which stores belong to whom, and how goods move across hundreds of miles. Break the machine and the knowledge inside it can become useless almost immediately. A written text is only as durable as the community that can read it. The same pattern appeared in the ancient Maya world. For centuries, Maya city-states built monumental temples, mapped celestial cycles, recorded dynasties, and maintained complex systems of farming and water management. Then, especially in parts of the southern lowlands, populations declined and major cities were gradually abandoned between the 8th and 10th centuries CE. There was no single Maya collapse. Different regions changed at different times. Drought likely played a role. So did warfare, political competition, environmental pressure, and the burden of supporting powerful rulers. The Maya did not disappear. Millions of Maya people live today. Their languages, traditions, foodways, and identities endured. But many great cities fell silent. Courts that sponsored scribes and monuments no longer functioned. Dynastic records stopped. Knowledge once carved in stone and painted in books became harder to preserve. Then, centuries later, Spanish conquest and colonial destruction erased much more. Most Maya codices were burned. What survived was only a fraction. Imagine trying to understand an entire civilization from 4 surviving books. That is not just a Maya problem, it is a human problem. Rome offers another version of the story. The Western Roman Empire did not vanish in one dramatic day in 476 CE, even if that date is convenient for textbooks. Roman institutions weakened over generations. Civil wars, economic strain, epidemics, invasions, political fragmentation, and the sheer difficulty of governing a vast territory all took their toll. In some places, cities shrank, roads decayed, tax systems changed, long-distance trade contracted. Yet Rome continued in the East for nearly 1,000 more years. Roman law, language, religion, engineering, and administration survived in altered forms across Europe, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. Collapse was also transformation. But transformation can still mean loss. A society may retain the ability to build houses while losing the ability to maintain aqueducts. It may preserve religious texts while losing technical manuals. It may remember that its ancestors crossed an ocean while forgetting how their boats were designed. It may inherit a ruined monument and turn it into a sacred mystery, because nobody remembers the calculations, labour systems, or political decisions that created it. This is especially true for highly specialised knowledge. Most people in any civilization do not know how to make steel, navigate by stars, manufacture medicines, repair a power grid, decode a legal archive, or operate a satellite network. They rely on specialists. Specialists rely on schools, workshops, supply chains, patrons, archives, and stable communities. Remove those supports, and even brilliant knowledge can disappear in a generation or two. There are skills today that exist in the minds of only a handful of people. There are computer systems maintained by teams who understand languages, code, hardware, and infrastructure that most of the population never sees. There are scientific databases requiring constant electricity, cooling, replacement parts, passwords, and software updates. We think of digital information as permanent because it can be copied instantly. But digital information may be more fragile than clay. A clay tablet can sit buried in dry soil for 4,000 years and still be read. A stone inscription can survive rain, war, and empire. An oral tradition can cross centuries if communities keep telling it. But a hard drive can fail within years. A server farm goes dark when power stops. A file becomes unreadable when its format disappears. An encrypted archive without the key might as well be a sealed tomb. Our civilization produces more information than any society in history. But how much of it will remain understandable after a century of disruption? That question matters when we look backward. Earlier societies may have left only fragments behind, not because they were imaginary, but because collapse is efficient at destroying context. Floodwater scatters objects. Fires consume wood and textiles. New cities are built over old ones. Survivors reuse stone, melt metal, and carry portable valuables away. Coastlines drown. Forests reclaim roads. Languages change until inscriptions become silent marks. What reaches us is often the hardiest residue of a much larger world. A broken wall, a few tools, a burial, a legend, a strange alignment of stones. A story about a flood remembered long after the river changed course. That does not prove there were 6 forgotten global civilizations before ours. But it explains why the record of any ancient society can look incomplete, distorted, and almost impossibly thin. Civilizations do not need to be erased from existence to become archaeological ghosts. They only need their institutions to fail, their knowledge networks to break, and enough time to pass. And that brings us back to the biggest question in this entire story. Are we really the 7th civilization? After Göbekli Tepe, Mesopotamia, pre-dynastic Egypt, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, and the Andes, it is tempting to line them up like 6 chapters before us. 6 great human experiments. 6 worlds that rose, transformed, or collapsed. And now us, civilization number 7, staring at their ruins and wondering whether we are following the same path. But we need to be careful with that idea, because the 6 civilizations we have explored are real. Their cities, monuments, artifacts, farms, graves, canals, roads, inscriptions, and astronomical systems are real. Archaeologists have excavated them. Scientists have dated them. Historians can trace many of their connections, their technologies, their trade routes, their political struggles, and in some cases even the names of their rulers. Göbekli Tepe is real. Its massive carved pillars prove that people were building monumental ritual spaces before agriculture had fully transformed their lives. But it was not a global empire with skyscrapers, electricity, or forgotten machines. It was evidence that hunter-gatherer societies could organize labour, share beliefs, and create architecture far more complex than older theories expected. Mesopotamia is real. Cities like Uruk, Eridu, and Babylon helped pioneer writing, bureaucracy, urban life, formal law, large-scale irrigation, and long-distance trade. They did not emerge from nowhere. They grew over thousands of years from villages, temples, farms, and expanding networks along the rivers of the Fertile Crescent. Egypt is real. Its dynasties left pyramids, tombs, temples, ships, papyri, tools, and inscriptions in astonishing abundance. But Egypt too had a long beginning. Before the pharaohs there were farming communities, regional cultures, trade routes, and competing local powers. The civilization of the Nile was not suddenly switched on. It was built slowly, generation by generation. The Indus Valley is real. Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Dolavira, and hundreds of other settlements show a civilization of planned streets, drainage systems, standardized weights, skilled craft production and trade across enormous distances. Its script remains unread, which gives it an aura of mystery. But unread does not mean unknowable. It means we have a puzzle, not a blank check for any theory we want. Mesoamerica is real. The Olmec, Maya, Zapotec, Teotihuacanos, and many other societies developed cities, writing, mathematics, calendars, agriculture, and political systems suited to their own landscapes. Their knowledge of time and astronomy was extraordinary. But it was human knowledge, built through observation, record-keeping, ritual, debate, and centuries of accumulated experience. And the Andes are real. From Caral and Javin to Tiwanaku, Wari, and the Inca Andean societies, engineered mountain landscapes on a scale that still seems almost impossible. Terraces, roads, suspension bridges, storehouses, irrigation systems, and high-altitude farming supported millions of people in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Their achievements do not need mysterious outside help to be impressive. They are impressive precisely because humans did them. So no, the evidence does not show that 6 separate global advanced civilizations existed before ours, each rising and falling across the entire planet in some repeating cycle. The archaeological record does not reveal a lost industrial age before the Bronze Age. It does not show ancient factories, power grids, computer networks, fossil fuel extraction on a modern scale, or worldwide technological systems buried beneath every continent. If such civilizations had existed, they would have left traces. Not just one strange stone, one underwater wall, or one legend copied centuries later. They would leave mines, waste dumps, mass-produced alloys, chemical pollution in ice cores and lake sediments, vast layers of industrial debris, evidence of global trade in manufactured materials, genetic signatures of huge population movements, thousands of settlements linked by roads, ports, workshops, and administrative records. Modern civilization leaves evidence everywhere. Concrete, plastic, aluminum, radioactive isotopes from nuclear testing, carbon from fossil fuels, chemicals that will remain in sediments long after our cities are gone. Even if every building collapsed tomorrow, future archaeologists would know something enormous had happened here. That is the standard a forgotten super-civilization would have to meet, and so far it has not. But that does not mean the past is simple. The strongest case for lost worlds is not a vanished planet-wide civilization. It is the much more realistic possibility that many early settlements are still hidden from us. Some are buried beneath modern cities, some lie under forests, deserts, and farmland. Some were built from wood, reeds, mud brick, and fibre, materials that disappear fast. And some are underwater, drowned when sea levels rose after the last ice age. That last possibility is especially important. When the glaciers melted, global sea levels rose by more than 100 meters. Vast coastal plains vanished beneath the oceans, places where ancient people may have camped, fished, traded, buried their dead, and built seasonal settlements are now on the seafloor. We have barely explored them. That means there could be coastal communities older than many known sites. There could be early ports, fishing villages, ritual centres, and trade networks whose remains have been hidden underwater for thousands of years. That would change history, but it would not automatically mean Atlantis was real. It would not prove forgotten machines or a civilization technologically equal to ours. It would mean something more subtle and in many ways more profound. It would mean human societies became organized, inventive, and connected earlier than we thought. To truly overturn the story of civilization, we would need discoveries that cannot be explained by the gradual development we already see in the record. A securely dated settlement, tens of thousands of years older than the first cities, but with writing, large-scale metallurgy, complex administration, and clear evidence of dense urban populations. A buried industrial landscape from the Ice Age, a consistent network of sites across continents, all showing technology that belongs nowhere in the known sequence of human development. One artifact would not be enough. An anomaly is a question. A civilization is a pattern, and patterns require evidence. For now, the most honest answer is this. We are not civilization number 7 in a literal proven list. Human history is not a neat staircase with 6 lost worlds beneath our feet and one final world at the top. It is more like a vast braided river. Communities form. Knowledge gathers, cities rise, networks spread, then drought, war, migration, disease, environmental change, or political failure breaks the current apart. Some branches disappear. Others flow on. Old ideas survive inside new cultures. A technique invented in one valley travels to another. A flood story outlives the flood. A ruined city becomes sacred ground for people who no longer remember its builders. We are not separate from that story. We are one more chapter in a human journey far older, stranger, and more uneven than the clean timelines in our textbooks. And that may be the most important thing to take away from all of this. The mystery is not smaller than history, it is bigger. Not because every ancient legend is a literal record of a vanished super-civilization. Not because a submerged stone formation automatically proves Atlantis. Not because an unread inscription gives us permission to invent whatever story we want. The mystery is bigger because the real human past is already more extraordinary than the simplified version most of us grew up with. For a long time, the story sounded straightforward. First, there were primitive people, then agriculture appeared, then villages, then cities, then writing, kings, monuments, and civilization. A clean upward line, a ladder with humanity slowly climbing from darkness into knowledge. But archaeology keeps showing us that the ladder was never that clean. People were organizing massive building projects before farming had fully taken hold. They were navigating oceans earlier than we once believed. They were trading shells, obsidian, pigments, metals, and ideas across distances that should have been impossible for supposedly isolated communities. They were watching the sky, tracking seasons, engineering water systems, reshaping mountainsides, and building cities with sanitation, planning, and social coordination that would challenge many societies thousands of years later. They were not modern people trapped in the past. They did not have our machines, our laboratories, our satellites, or our digital networks. But they were not simple either. They were human beings with intelligence, imagination, memory, ambition, fear, faith, and the same basic need to solve problems before those problems killed them. And when you really think about that, the known record becomes almost as astonishing as the legends. A civilization does not need electricity to be advanced in the ways that matter to the people living inside it. A society that can feed a city from a desert river, move stone blocks weighing dozens of tons, track celestial cycles across centuries, organize labour among thousands of people, or preserve knowledge through symbols and ritual has already achieved something remarkable. The ancient world was not empty. It was not waiting for us to arrive and explain it. It was full of experiments. Some worked for centuries. Some worked for millennia. Some collapsed so completely that later people built new lives on top of the ruins without knowing what had been there before. And that is where the possibility of lost chapters becomes real. Not lost global empires with secret aircraft and power plants hidden beneath every ocean. There is no evidence for that. But lost chapters, forgotten regional cultures, coastal societies swallowed by rising water, networks of people whose homes were built from wood, reeds, fibres and earth, leaving almost nothing behind. Those are not fantasies. Those are exactly the kinds of things history can erase. Imagine building your entire world along a coastline 15,000 years ago. Your people know the tides. They know where the fish gather. They know which season brings storms, which river channel is safe, which hill contains the stone you need for tools. They have burial grounds, meeting places, stories tied to certain rocks and coves. Maybe they trade with communities far inland. Maybe they return to the same sacred site for generations. Then the ice sheets melt. Over thousands of years, the sea keeps rising. Not in one cinematic wave, not necessarily in a single night, but slowly enough that each generation moves a little farther back, and quickly enough that the old world is never recovered. Camps become marshes, marshes become bays, bays become open sea. The places where people once lived, argued, loved, buried their dead, and taught their children how to survive disappear beneath more than 100 meters of water. And today, much of that landscape is inaccessible, difficult to map, and almost impossible to excavate. The same thing can happen on land. A flood can cover a settlement in sediment. A volcano can bury it. An earthquake can break its walls apart. A river can change course. A drought can drive away the population until wind and sand erase the buildings. Forest can reclaim stone. Roots can crack foundations. Mud brick can return to mud in a few seasons if nobody maintains it. Time does not need to destroy everything dramatically. Most of the time it just keeps going, and humans are very good at forgetting. We forget languages. We forget migration routes. We forget why a temple was built, who first dug a canal, what a symbol meant, or where a people went after their city failed. Sometimes the only thing that survives is a story. A flood, a golden age, a teacher from before the darkness. A great city under the water. Stories are not proof. But they are not meaningless either. They can preserve emotional truth even when literal details change. They can carry memories of disaster, migration, environmental change, and cultural loss across generations. The challenge is learning how to listen to them without confusing memory with measurement. That is the balance. Stay curious enough to ask whether history still has missing pages, but stay rigorous enough to ask what evidence would prove it, because extraordinary claims should not be protected from questions. They should survive questions. They should become stronger when tested against dates, sediments, artifacts, genetics, geology, inscriptions, and the hard, patient work of archaeology. If a theory cannot survive evidence, then it is not a hidden truth. It is just a story we wanted to be true. But if new evidence appears, real evidence, clear patterns from securely dated sites, then history must change. That is not a weakness of science. That is the whole point. The past is not decided by who tells the most exciting tale. It is decided slowly and imperfectly by what the world still allows us to find. Maybe future underwater archaeology will reveal settlements that transform what we know about Ice Age societies. Maybe an inscription will finally unlock the Indus script. Maybe a buried city beneath jungle, desert, or modern streets will show that ancient people were connected in ways we have not yet imagined. Or maybe the greatest revelation will be simpler. Maybe we will discover that civilization was never one invention, never one beginning, never one straight line. Maybe it emerged again and again in different places, through different people, whenever knowledge, cooperation, environment, and opportunity came together at the right moment. Not 6 civilizations before us, not one final civilization after them, but countless human worlds, each carrying something forward, each losing something too. And us, standing here in the present, surrounded by technology our ancestors could never have imagined, still asking the same ancient question. Who were we before we became who we are? If this journey through forgotten cities, flood memories, submerged landscapes and ancient mysteries made you see history differently, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you are listening from. And if you want to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify through the link in the description. Because somewhere beneath the sea, beneath the soil, beneath the streets of modern cities, there may still be evidence waiting. Not necessarily proof that we are the 7th civilization, but proof that the human story is far from finished,